Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, my dear friends. The empire bowed before her, but no one could stand the smell when standing near her. In that splendid palace, people did not smell the scent of flowers, but the smell of old sweat, musty perfume, and unwashed nightgowns. The dirtiest secrets were not in the royal archives, but deep in every layer of dress, every bed, every remaining stain. Tonight, let's lie back and sink into the disgusting hygiene habits of Queen Victoria. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one considers the daily habits of Queen Victoria, the most striking detail at the beginning is her unusual fear of water. Bathing was seen by her as an act that could weaken the body, disturb the balance of her health, and even threaten her sense of authority. This was not entirely an invention of her own mind, since in the Victorian era, many people suspected that sudden contact with cold water could bring about chills, fevers, or worse. Still, her refusal was far stronger than that of her subjects. She avoided immersion whenever possible. Instead of using a bath as we would understand it today, she depended on cloth soaked in alcohol. Wine or spirits would be poured over soft towels, and these towels were rubbed across her body to give an impression of cleanliness. The alcohol might have left a cooling sting, and it might have killed a handful of surface bacteria, but it could not replace the function of water and soap. The baths that stood in her rooms were not centers of hygiene, but objects rarely filled with fresh water. When they were used, it was not by following any standard of cleanliness that we would accept. Water was poured in, sometimes used more than once, and only replaced when the color changed or an odor became undeniable. This practice was closer to maintaining appearances than to maintaining health. To think of it now is unsettling. It is almost laughable that a woman who ruled over an empire believed that sitting in a basin of stale water was a sign of discipline rather than neglect. Yet within the palace walls her choices became the standard, and no servant was in a position to protest. The staff were instructed to keep cloths and alcohol always at hand. These items were to be prepared daily, so that the queen might wipe herself whenever she wished. The scent of spirits clung to her skin, giving the impression that she had just left a tavern rather than a chamber. The smell lingered on her gowns and in the fabric of the furniture. Servants noticed, of course, but none dared comment. To do so would risk accusations of insolence. Silence was the rule, obedience the duty. This silence extended beyond the staff. Courtiers and visiting officials knew nothing of these private routines. They saw the queen in her public role, dressed in silks and jewelry, her image carefully preserved behind closed doors. However, the reality was different. The heavy curtains were kept closed to avoid drafts. The windows seldom opened, and the chambers were heavy with air that had not been refreshed. Every fabric absorbed what her body released. The mingling of alcohol, sweat, and unwashed skin created an odor that would have pressed itself onto anyone who entered. If this were to happen today, it would be like a head of state refusing to bathe and instead covering themselves with scented wipes, insisting that the body's natural odor should simply be accepted. The illusion might last in photographs or ceremonies, but not for those who spent time near the person. The idea of bathing as dangerous was tied to Victorian medical uncertainty. Doctors themselves were divided on what caused disease, and ordinary people were left to superstition. Victoria's insistence on avoiding water was an extreme, but not isolated version of this. Still, for someone of her power, it set a troubling example. Her personal belief became practice not only for herself, but for those who had to care for her. Servants were required to follow her instructions to the letter regardless of their own understanding. They carried basins of used water, handled cloths damp with wine, and endured the stale smell of a body only half clean. For them, it was labor without question. The palace was not built to handle such neglect gracefully. Heavy velvet curtains, thick wool carpets, and ornate upholstery trapped every odor. Without fresh air or thorough washing, these surfaces became long-term storage for the queen's habits. Dust mixed with alcohol fumes, sweat settled into fibers, and the atmosphere grew denser each week. It was a setting meant to project wealth, yet it quietly collected the signs of poor hygiene. I find it unsettling to imagine stepping into a grand chamber hung with gold and velvet, only to be met with the sour smell of unwashed skin masked by spirits. This is not an image of majesty, but of denial. There were some attempts by physicians to persuade her otherwise, but they were brief and ineffectual. The science of the time was too uncertain to provide authority strong enough to overturn the Queen's convictions. A suggestion to bathe more often could be brushed aside as medical fashion. Victoria trusted her own sense of discipline more than the words of her doctors. She believed that avoiding indulgence made her stronger, and to her, bathing was indulgence. Her children and close attendants were inevitably affected by this environment. To live near her was to live with her rules. That meant enduring the smells, following the rituals, and never speaking openly of their doubts. What might have been considered eccentric in another household became unchallengeable in hers. The contradiction between public image and private life was sharp. In public, she was the image of order and strength. In private, she followed practices that belonged more to old fears than to modern science. The resistance to water shaped her life for decades. It was not a passing habit, but a lasting conviction. This makes it one of the defining features of her private existence. When one thinks of Queen Victoria now, one imagines stern portraits, royal ceremonies, and political power. But hidden beneath those images was a woman who considered water an enemy and replaced it with wine-soaked towels. Her fear of water was more than just a personal quirk. It affected the cleanliness of her rooms, the health of those around her, and the comfort of everyone who entered her space. It left behind smells and residues that clung to the palace itself in a century that prided itself on progress, invention, and empire. This habit stood out as a reminder that superstition and neglect could live even in the heart of power. Victoria's refusal to bathe left her relying on alcohol-soaked cloths and stale water, filling her chambers with odor that never left. Yet what carried those odors most directly were not the curtains or the carpets, but the garments she wore against her own skin each day. Those garments became objects of unease, handled with care and secrecy by the servants who dared not disobey her. The garments worn closest to Queen Victoria's body were among the most private objects in the palace. Yet they became a source of discomfort and quiet dread. Her underclothes were thick, heavy layers made to absorb sweat, oils, and menstrual blood, and they were not changed often. These garments were worn for many days in a row, and only when the stains and discoloration became impossible to overlook were they finally removed. Servants could not suggest a change, nor could they act without her direct instruction. The decision belonged to her alone, and her word determined how long each piece would remain in use. This left those who handled the clothing in a difficult position, forced to obey commands that defied the basic standards of cleanliness. The material of the undergarments was strong but coarse. Cotton and linen layers grew stiff with repeated use, clinging to the body as they collected the fluids of daily life. Sweat soaked through during warm days and cold nights alike, leaving dark patches that hardened as they dried. During menstruation, the stains deepened, and the garments became heavy with a mix of fluids. Despite this, the Queen continued wearing them, convinced that frequent changes weakened the body and disrupted its natural rhythms. It is almost absurd to think of the richest woman in the world treating her underwear like an heirloom to be preserved rather than a simple necessity to be cleaned. When a garment was finally removed, the servants had clear instructions. They were to fold it carefully, sometimes air it near a window, and then store it away until told otherwise. Washing was not automatic, and in some cases the item would simply be dried and reused without proper cleaning. Servants were warned not to hold the fabric too close to their faces, as the smell could overwhelm them. They carried the garments at arm's length, trying not to breathe too deeply. The act of caring for these clothes was not a task anyone wanted, but it was a task none could refuse. The odor was unavoidable, even when folded and placed in storage. The smell lingered in the air. Cabinets took on the scent of stale sweat and old stains, spreading it slowly into the corners of the room. The longer the garments were left unwashed, the more persistent the smell became. It clung to the fabric of chairs, to curtains, and even to the hands of those who touched it. In a palace full of rich materials, these lingering odors created a quiet tension. They reminded everyone who worked there that beneath the surface of wealth and power was a body left unclean. For the queen, the reluctance to wash or replace undergarments was linked to a belief in discipline. She saw endurance as a virtue and treated discomfort as proof of strength. If a garment felt stiff or heavy, it was a sign to her that she was resisting weakness, not a reason to change. The servants who suffered the consequences had no such comfort. To them it was simply dirt and smell carried day after day until their work demanded they handle it again. If this happened today, it would be like a world leader insisting that the same underwear could be worn for weeks with aides assigned to fold and air it rather than wash it. The comparison makes clear how strange and humiliating this practice would be in any age. Medical advice was sometimes offered, but the queen trusted her own habits more than the words of physicians. In her mind, overwashing could cause irritation or weakness, and cleanliness did not mean constant renewal. What appeared to outsiders as neglect was to her discipline and restraint. This belief was supported by her authority, which silenced any opposition. Servants knew that questioning her orders would mean dismissal, and dismissal from royal service was a ruin few could risk. So they obeyed, carrying out their duties in silence, even when the work was distasteful. There were, of course, health consequences. Prolonged contact with soiled fabric caused rashes, irritation, and sometimes infections. These were explained away as natural ailments or the unavoidable effects of age. No one could suggest that the habits themselves might be the cause. Silence became the shield that protected her practices, and those who lived with the results had no choice but to endure. I find it unsettling to imagine being one of those servants, forced to fold garments stiff with stains and place them neatly away as if they were fine linens. The thought underlines how power can turn ordinary disgust into an accepted routine. The garments symbolized more than neglect. They reflected the contradictions of her reign. She ruled over a nation that prided itself on progress. Yet her personal life resisted the simplest advances in hygiene. She was the figurehead of an empire, but her daily practices would have been considered unacceptable even among the working poor. In this way, the underclothes became an unseen emblem of hypocrisy. They were hidden from public view, but within the palace, they defined the experience of those closest to her. The servants sometimes shared their discomfort in letters or private notes. Descriptions of the smell, the stiffness of fabric, and the reluctance to wash appear in scattered accounts that have survived. These accounts show how the routines of one woman could impose hardship on many others. In a palace where everything glittered with wealth, the most ordinary duty became a burden of odor and stain. It is important to remember that undergarments were not simply fabric in that era. They were considered personal and intimate, linked to modesty and propriety. To handle them without permission was to cross a line, yet in this case the servants were commanded to do so regularly. The paradox was clear. The items were both sacred and foul, untouchable yet constantly touched. The queen's will turned them into symbols of control, leaving those beneath her with no voice to object. The undergarments that clung to Victoria's body carried sweat, stains, and odor. Yet they were preserved with a care that made no sense outside the palace. They became the silent burden of those who folded and stored them, a duty carried out in obedience rather than reason. But the air of her chambers held more than the smell of fabric, for even the very bed where she slept became heavy with something no servant could ever forget. The private chambers of Queen Victoria were closed spaces, sealed against the outside world. The bed at the center of her room was large and heavy, surrounded by thick curtains that blocked the flow of air. These curtains were drawn tightly, turning the bed into an enclosed compartment. The belief was that drafts of cold air could bring illness, so windows were rarely opened, and air circulation was almost non-existent. Inside such conditions, smells did not escape, but lingered. The result was a constant heaviness in the room, a mix of odors that no servant could fully describe, yet none could ignore. The bedding itself was rarely washed. Sheets might be changed after long intervals, but the heavier materials, such as the mattress or the padded cover beneath, were left untouched for months at a time. Sweat soaked into them night after night, and over time the layers absorbed more than fabric was meant to hold. When a servant approached the bed to straighten it, the smell would rise, catching in the throat and making breathing difficult. It is almost ridiculous that a queen who valued dignity allowed her bed to become something closer to a cellar of damp cloth than a place of rest. Yet this was accepted as normal within the palace, because it was her command. The room was designed with luxury in mind, but the materials of luxury only deepened the problem. Velvet, brocade, and heavy wool clung to odor. The thick drapes and carpets trapped every trace of stale air. Without circulation, the scent grew more pronounced each week. Dust settled over everything, but the real presence was the invisible layer of sweat, oils, and exhaled breath that collected without release. The combination created an atmosphere described by one servant as something that clung to the throat. This description captures the suffocating nature of the space, not just unpleasant, but oppressive. For those who worked inside, it became a duty to endure. Servants could not complain, though they felt the weight of the air each time they entered. They followed the rituals of smoothing sheets, straightening curtains, and sprinkling perfumes at the edges of the bed. But the perfumes only mixed with the odor, masking nothing. The scents of flowers and oils blended with sweat and dust, producing a fragrance that was stranger, not cleaner. If the same conditions were recreated today, it would be like sealing a bedroom with plastic curtains and never washing the sheets, while spraying air freshener each morning as if that solved the problem. From a distance, the room would look rich and cared for, but inside it was another story. Victoria herself accepted this as part of her life. She saw no danger in leaving the bedding untouched, believing that the body's natural strength could overcome discomfort. To her, drafts of fresh air were a greater risk than stale air, so windows stayed closed. She believed in endurance, not indulgence, and thought that changing sheets too often weakened the spirit. What might seem like neglect to us was to her discipline. It was another example of how her personal ideas of hygiene overruled both advice and common sense. The servants bore the consequences. They carried out their work with cloths tied at their necks or hands held near their faces. Some recorded in letters that the smell stayed on their clothing long after leaving the room. The odor became part of their lives, lingering on their skin and hair. They accepted it as part of their duty, but privately they were unsettled. I find it disturbing to imagine walking into such a chamber with curtains closed, air unmoving, and fabric heavy with years of sweat, while being expected to treat it as a place of dignity. The image is less royal than it is suffocating. The problem was not confined to the bed. The whole room absorbed what the bed released. Thick carpets beneath, upholstered chairs nearby, and curtains that stretched from ceiling to floor all carried the same weight of odor. When visitors entered, they may have noticed, but said nothing. Etiquette demanded silence. Within the court, the truth about the Queen's bedroom was left unspoken. Yet, everyone close to her knew the contradiction was sharp. Britain was seen as a leader of progress, invention, and power. But its ruler lived in chambers that resisted the simplest forms of cleanliness. In public, she was an image of order. In private, her surroundings carried the marks of neglect. The difference between appearance and reality was stark, and yet the system of service, respect, and fear ensured that no change occurred. Reports from those years mentioned that servants sometimes sprinkled vinegar on rags and placed them near the bed to dull the smell. Others lit candles or burned herbs to shift the air, but these were temporary measures. Nothing removed the core problem, which was that the bed itself and the curtains around it were never given the treatment they needed. The palace continued to function as if all was well. The Queen continued to sleep in the same conditions. The atmosphere in her chambers became part of the unspoken burdens of palace life. It showed how personal habits of one woman could affect the daily lives of many others. Servants learned to breathe shallowly, to stay as brief as possible, and to escape the room as soon as duties were done. For them, it was a reminder that service meant silence even in the face of discomfort. The bed remained a private world, shielded by curtains and unchallenged by advice. Its odors were the secret weight carried by the walls of the palace, a hidden truth behind the grandeur of public ceremonies. It is here that the distance between royal image and private habit is felt most clearly. The heavy air of Victoria's bedroom was not only a matter of physical discomfort, but of symbolic meaning. It represented the persistence of old fears and old practices, even as the world moved forward. In the silence of those chambers, the progress of an empire was left outside the door, while inside the Queen clung to routines that belonged more to the past than to the present. Victoria's room, with its thick curtains and untouched bedding, became a chamber of stale air, a place where even the strongest servant struggled to remain. The smell that clung to the throat was a constant presence, a daily reminder of how power could reshape the simplest truths of cleanliness. The Queen saw it as order and protection, but those who entered knew it as suffocation. The sealed room of Victoria was heavy with odor, its curtains and bedding trapping the breath of years. Servants endured it silently, while perfumes and herbs failed to change its nature. Yet, beneath the bed, and hidden from sight, lay something even more unsettling, a vessel of waste that defined her nights more strongly than any curtain or sheet. Beneath the bed of Queen Victoria rested an object that defined the private reality of her nights, a chamber pot without a lid. It was placed directly under the heavy frame of the bed, close enough that she could use it whenever she needed to during the dark hours. The pot was not covered, not emptied during the night, and not treated with any substance to reduce the smell. Each morning a servant was required to remove it, but until then, its contents remained in the closed air of her bedroom. The odor seeped into the curtains, carpets, and thick fabrics of the room. By the time the sun rose, the smell had already become part of the space, impossible to erase. The chamber pot was porcelain, plain in form, and heavy once filled. Without a lid, it stood open to the air, releasing a constant presence that grew stronger as the hours passed. It was positioned as if it were part of the furniture, accepted as normal within her daily life. The lack of shame or secrecy in this practice was striking. In a household that projected grandeur and formality, the Queen herself allowed her most private waste to rest in the same room where she slept. It is almost darkly humorous to imagine the symbol of an empire sleeping just above a pot of waste that no one dared mention. The servants tasked with removing it followed strict instructions. They were told not to look too closely, not to breathe deeply, and to carry the pot away with as much silence as possible. It was to be emptied each morning, scrubbed lightly, and returned to its place for the next night, no matter how unpleasant. The task was performed without question. Servants learned to hold their breath, move quickly, and treat the pot as if it were simply another royal object. Their discomfort was irrelevant compared to the duty of obedience. The smell did not vanish when the pot was carried out. By then it had already penetrated the thick velvet curtains, seeped into the carpets, and clung to the walls. Candles, incense, and perfumes were used to soften it, but none of these methods worked fully. Instead, the scents layered on top of one another, producing a heavy atmosphere that was neither fresh nor pleasant. Visitors might not have been able to identify the source, but they felt the heaviness in the air. If such a practice existed today, it would be like a world leader keeping an open toilet under their bed and asking staff to ignore the smell until morning. The idea is difficult to accept, yet in the palace it was simply routine. For Victoria, the convenience outweighed any consideration of cleanliness. She disliked the idea of walking through cold halls to a lavatory at night, and she distrusted the new flushing toilets that were being introduced. She claimed the sound of rushing water disturbed dignity and order. So the pot remained her preferred choice, an object of daily necessity that carried with it the weight of neglect. To her it was practical. To everyone else it was something they endured in silence. The servants' experiences were captured in occasional writings, though not in official records. One noted that lifting the pot was like carrying a piece of the night itself, heavy and unavoidable. Another wrote that the smell lingered on their hands no matter how hard they washed. These testimonies reveal the burden that came with proximity to the Queen. It was not just labor, but the acceptance of conditions that would have been unthinkable elsewhere. I find it unsettling to imagine being in that position, told not to breathe while carrying waste that had soaked into carpets worth fortunes. The clash between wealth and reality could not have been sharper. The chamber pot became part of the identity of her bedroom. It represented more than convenience. It showed how personal beliefs and fears overruled new technologies. While others in Britain slowly accepted modern sanitation, she resisted. Her rejection of toilets was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic because it showed her distrust of change. Practical because it left her servants with a daily task of handling waste in a way that spread odor throughout the palace. The presence of the pot affected the wider environment. Carpets beneath the bed became saturated with the smell over time. No amount of cleaning could fully remove it. The air in the room never felt fresh, even after the windows were briefly opened. The heaviness of the odor became part of palace life, endured by those who entered and ignored by those who ruled. It was another example of how power insulated the queen from consequences, while leaving others to cope. The contradiction remained visible in the details of her reign. She was a figure who stood for order, discipline, and moral strength. Yet her own bedroom revealed a private world of neglect. The open pot beneath the bed symbolized the difference between the public image of progress and the private acceptance of filth. Britain advanced in industry, science, and empire, but its queen clung to a practice that belonged to an earlier time. The contrast was stark, and it shaped the daily experiences of all who served her. The pot was carried out each morning, emptied and returned. The cycle repeated every day, unchanged for years. It became a rhythm of palace life, a small act that revealed a larger truth. The smell never truly left. The servants never complained openly. The queen never changed her mind. Victoria's chamber pot stood beneath her bed night after night, an object without a cover that filled her rooms with odor and her servants with dread. It defined the hidden reality of her chambers, reminding all who entered that power could excuse even the most unpleasant routines. Yet beyond the bed and its hidden pot, her habits extended further, touching the very way she cared for her body from head to toe. And when it came to her hair, the practices she followed carried their own mixture of strangeness and discomfort. Queen Victoria's hair was one of her most visible features in portraits and public ceremonies, but the way she cared for it in private revealed practices far removed from the polished image. She disliked the use of soaps and shampoos, fearing that these products would damage her scalp and cause her hair to thin. Instead, she relied on a mixture of eggs, sheep fat, and dark beer. These ingredients were common in older household remedies, but in her case, they became a long-term substitute for any modern method of cleaning. The mixture was poured into her hair, rubbed in, and then left to sit before being rinsed lightly with water or wiped away with cloths. Rather than leaving her hair fresh, the result was often heavy, greasy, and faintly sour with the smell of fermentation. The frequency of this washing was low. She had her hair treated in this way about once a month, sometimes even less often. Between treatments, the oils and residues built up, making her hair cling together in strands that stuck against her scalp. The smell was noticeable to those who worked near her, a faint odor of yeast and old fat that could not be ignored. It is almost comical to imagine a ruler of an empire appearing in portraits with hair that had been steeped in beer and animal fat, then combed through as if that were a mark of elegance. Yet in the palace this routine was accepted without question. The tools she used for grooming reflected the same neglect. Her combs and brushes were made of silver, ornate and expensive, but they were never properly cleaned. They were only wiped with dirty cloths after use, leaving behind traces of oil and residue. Over time, these tools became darkened and sticky, holding the smell of the substances applied to her hair. Servants handled them carefully, as they were valuable objects, but they carried with them the evidence of long neglect. The smell of her hair filled her bedroom when it was being treated. The mixture of egg yolk and beer released a sour odor that clung to fabrics and curtains. The fat left greasy marks on linens and towels, making them difficult to reuse. After each session, the servants aired out the room as best they could. But with windows rarely opened, the air remained heavy. Perfumes were sprinkled on her hair and sprayed in the room. But this only added another layer of scent without removing the original one. If this routine existed today, it would be like someone insisting on washing their hair with butter and stale beer once a month, then brushing it with tools that had never seen soap. The comparison shows clearly how strange this practice would appear in any modern setting. For Victoria, these methods were not acts of neglect, but of care. She believed that avoiding harsh soaps preserved her natural strength, and that traditional remedies kept her hair thick. She trusted old habits more than new products. The greasy texture and lingering odor were signs to her that the treatment was working. Servants might have seen it differently, but they had no choice except to follow the process she demanded. The appearance of her hair in public was managed carefully, styled into tight arrangements, covered with veils, or set under crowns. The grease and odor were hidden from view. What the public saw was a queen with orderly hair, a symbol of discipline. What the servants saw was something else entirely, a head of hair coated with substances that clung and soured over time. The contradiction between image and reality was sharp, and once again, it was the staff who bore the discomfort. I find it disturbing to imagine standing behind her chair, brushing through strands that stuck together with fat, while knowing that the brush itself had not been washed in months. The task would have been more unpleasant than ceremonial. Her resistance to shampoo and modern cleaning agents was another example of how personal conviction outweighed advice. As newer products became available in the 19th century, some doctors and reformers promoted them as healthier alternatives. But the Queen dismissed such advice, preferring what she believed to be safer and more natural. To her, animal fat and beer were reliable, familiar, and proven. To others, they were reminders of old habits that refused to fade. The consequences of these routines extended beyond odor. Buildup on the scalp could cause irritation, dandruff, and infection. Yet, these problems were explained away as minor inconveniences or as natural effects of age. No one suggested that her methods might be the cause. The Queen's word overruled observation, and her habits continued unchanged. Servants adapted by enduring the smell, keeping their distance when possible, and cleaning up the mess left behind. The hair rituals fit into a larger pattern of her life. They showed the same mistrust of water, the same resistance to new technologies, and the same belief in discipline through discomfort. Just as she avoided bathing, she avoided soap for her hair. Just as she slept above an open chamber pot, she wore her hair with a residue of beer and grease. The habits were consistent, and together they shaped the environment of the palace. For the servants, these rituals were a burden of silence. They carried bowls of beer and fat, applied them to her scalp, and combed through the strands that clung together. They then carried away towels and cloths soaked with grease, knowing the smell would linger on their hands. This was their daily reality, hidden from the public eye, but unforgettable to those who lived it. Victoria's hair treatments left her with greasy strands, sour smells, and tools that never saw proper cleaning. To her, it was strength and tradition. To those around her, it was another form of neglect wrapped in authority. The truth of her hair care practices reveals how power could transform private habits into unquestionable law. Her hair, coated in fat and beer, carried the odor of old remedies and the weight of neglect. Servants brushed and styled it into order. But beneath the crowns and veils, the reality remained. And if her hair seemed unpleasant, the way she treated her mouth revealed something even more troubling, for even her teeth were never cleaned in the way we might expect. The way Queen Victoria cared for her teeth was as unusual as her other habits. She disliked toothbrushes, believing that the bristles could loosen her teeth and cause them to fall out. This fear was common enough in her time when dental care was poorly understood, but she took it further than most. Instead of brushing, she wiped her teeth with cloths dipped in strong alcohol. Brandy or whiskey was applied to the cloth, and she rubbed it lightly across her front teeth, avoiding anything that might scrape or press too hard. The ritual gave her a sense of cleanliness without actually cleaning anything. Food particles, stains, and bacteria were left untouched in the gaps. The result was an illusion of care that hid decay beneath the surface. The smell of her breath was a constant presence. The alcohol did not remove odor, but added to it, mixing with the remains of food lodged between her teeth. In the mornings, her breath carried the scent of iron, alcohol, and spoiled meat. Servants and close attendants who had to stand near her noticed it, though none spoke openly. They endured it in silence, holding their breath when necessary, and waiting until they could step away. It is almost ironic that a queen surrounded by perfumes and fine silks carried a mouth that smelled more like a tavern than a palace. The cloths she used for wiping were often the same ones kept near her bedside or dressing table. They were not always washed between uses, only wrung out and left to dry. Over time, they stiffened with alcohol and residue. This meant that the very tool meant to clean her teeth was itself unclean. When she pressed it to her mouth, she spread old stains and bacteria rather than removing them. The belief that alcohol itself was enough to kill germs kept her convinced that she was protected, though the truth was otherwise. Her diet only made the problem worse. Heavy meats, rich sauces, and sweet puddings clung to her teeth. Without brushing, these remains hardened into deposits along her gums. The alcohol could not remove them, and so they built up over time. This caused inflammation, bleeding, and pain. But these were explained away as natural effects of age. The true cause, neglect of proper care, was never admitted. If a leader today refused to use a toothbrush and instead dabbed at their teeth with whiskey, it would cause shock and ridicule around the world. In her time, however, the silence of those around her protected her from criticism. Dentists were called to see her from time to time, but their work was limited. They were not permitted to scrape her teeth or probe too deeply. She distrusted their tools, believing that metal instruments could harm her energy and spirit. As a result, they could do little more than examine her from a distance and make polite comments. When pain became too severe, teeth were sometimes pulled, but no real prevention was ever attempted. The queen avoided anything that felt intrusive, even when it meant allowing decay to spread. Servants who attended her meals were the first to notice the condition of her mouth. Bits of food often stuck between her teeth and remained there until she wiped them with her cloth. The wiping was never thorough. Small particles remained and rotted slowly, adding to the odor of her breath. Sitting near her during meals became a challenge, but no one spoke out. Etiquette demanded silence, and the power of her presence demanded obedience. I find it unsettling to imagine leaning close to serve her, forced to breathe in air heavy with alcohol and rot, while pretending that nothing was wrong. Victoria believed strongly in discipline, and her resistance to toothbrushes was framed as another act of strength. To her, brushing was unnecessary, an indulgence invented by others. She trusted the sting of alcohol as proof of cleanliness, convinced that what burned must also purify. This belief gave her confidence, but it left her mouth in a state that only worsened with time. Servants adapted, dentists were silenced, and the routine continued year after year. The palace adapted as well. Perfumes and scented cloths were kept nearby to disguise the odor that lingered after meals. Rooms were aired more often than usual following her dinners, though without explanation. Guests noticed little because etiquette kept them at a distance. It was those in her closest circle who suffered most, caught between duty and discomfort. Her resistance to brushing fit perfectly with her other habits. Just as she avoided bathing and washing her hair properly, she avoided the toothbrush. Just as her chamber pot was left uncovered, her mouth was left untreated. The pattern was clear. Personal conviction was stronger than science, and tradition was stronger than progress. These habits defined her life and shaped the daily routines of those around her. The consequences became visible over the years. Her teeth darkened, chipped, and broke. Some fell out, leaving gaps that changed her speech. Yet even then, she did not embrace proper cleaning. She relied on her cloth and alcohol, believing them to be enough. The truth was plain to those around her, but truth was powerless in the face of royal command. Victoria's refusal to brush left her with a mouth that smelled of alcohol, iron, and old food, disguised only by perfumes and silence. Servants endured it daily. Dentists stood helpless, and she remained convinced of her own discipline. To the empire, she was a symbol of strength. To those close to her, she was a woman whose habits betrayed neglect more than majesty. Her teeth, wiped with cloth and alcohol but never brushed, carried the evidence of years of neglect. The smell of her breath spread through her chambers. her presence as strong as any perfume. And if her mouth seemed troubling, the way she handled the simplest of objects, her handkerchiefs, revealed another layer of habits that unsettled those who lived around her. Among the small objects that accompanied Queen Victoria each day, her handkerchiefs stood out not for their beauty, but for the way she used them. In most households, it was common to change handkerchiefs daily, especially among the wealthy, who could afford an abundance of clean fabric. For her, however, the same piece of cloth might be used repeatedly for a week or more. The handkerchief served many purposes. It was pressed against her face to blot sweat, lifted to her nose when she sniffled, and rubbed along her neck to absorb oil. The fabric collected powder that fell from her skin, dust from her gowns, and stains from whatever it touched. Over time, the cloth grew stiff and discolored, yet it remained part of her daily routine. These handkerchiefs were made of fine linen or cotton, sometimes trimmed with lace, but their quality did little to reduce the unpleasantness of repeated use. Once dampened with sweat or dust, they were hung over the headboard of her bed or placed on a nearby table to dry. Afterward, they were used again without washing. The result was a piece of cloth that held layer upon layer of residue. It is almost absurd to picture the Queen of the British Empire reusing a handkerchief stiff with sweat and powder, as if fine lace could transform dirt into something acceptable. Servants were instructed not to replace the cloths unless given permission. They might fold them neatly or move them to another location, but they were not to wash them without her command. This meant that the same handkerchief could circulate through her daily life until the smell became obvious. Even then, replacement was not guaranteed. The Queen had her own sense of timing and order, and her staff followed it without complaint. The smell of these cloths added to the already heavy atmosphere of her chambers, hung near her bed. They released odor into the air during the night. When she picked them up again in the morning, the dampness returned to her skin. The combination of sweat, powder, and dust made them both unpleasant and unhygienic. Yet to her, they were a sign of practicality, a habit that did not require constant attention. If a modern leader today insisted on using the same handkerchief for an entire week, carrying it from the bedroom to public events, it would be a scandal within hours. In her time, silence made it invisible to all but her closest attendants. For the servants, handling these cloths was another task added to their burden. They folded them, aired them, and placed them back within reach. The smell clung to their hands, especially when the cloths had been heavily used. Some servants noted privately that the stains and stiffness made the fabric unpleasant to touch. Still, obedience was required. Complaints could mean dismissal, and so silence prevailed. I find it disturbing to imagine lifting a handkerchief stained with sweat and pressed repeatedly against a face, only to fold it carefully as if it were a prized possession. This image captures the contradiction between royal wealth and private neglect. The presence of these cloths reflected more than personal choice. They showed how even the simplest standards of cleanliness could be ignored when reinforced by authority. A handkerchief is a small item, but in its repeated use, it became a symbol of the wider habits of the Queen. Her reluctance to replace or wash them paralleled her avoidance of bathing, hair washing, and dental care. It was part of a consistent pattern, one in which comfort and belief outweighed hygiene and science. The cloths also carried practical risks. Repeated contact with skin, especially when damp, could spread irritation and infection. Bacteria grew in the folds, and each reuse pressed them back against her face and neck. This might have contributed to the skin problems she sometimes suffered, though these were explained away as minor ailments. The connection between dirty handkerchiefs and skin irritation was never admitted. The Queen trusted her routines, and those around her had no voice to argue otherwise. In the wider culture of the 19th century, handkerchiefs carried symbolic meaning. They were seen as marks of refinement, often embroidered and displayed as tokens of status. For Victoria, however, their symbolic value clashed with their practical neglect. What should have been an emblem of dignity became another example of habits that contradicted her public image. Guests who saw her with lace-trimmed cloths assumed elegance, never realizing how long those cloths had been in use. The persistence of this routine again highlights the divide between public and private life. In public, she was the face of order, morality, and progress. In private, she was a woman who reused handkerchiefs until they were stiff with residue. The difference was hidden by silence, etiquette, and obedience. No one outside her chambers was allowed to know, and those inside had no power to speak. The handkerchiefs of Queen Victoria were more than cloth. They were daily objects that absorbed the residue of her life and released it into her chambers. They stood as quiet symbols of neglect, tolerated because of who she was, endured because of what she represented. Her handkerchiefs, reused day after day, absorbed sweat, powder, and odor, turning from fabric into carriers of neglect. Servants folded and replaced them without question, while the air of her chambers grew heavier with their presence. And while these cloths unsettled those who handled them, another habit within the palace caused even greater unease, one that involved not the queen herself, but the servants who tried to remain clean in her service. The servants who lived and worked inside the palace were bound by the habits of Queen Victoria just as much as by her authority. Their daily routines were shaped not only by duty, but also by the personal beliefs of the queen herself. One of the clearest examples of this came when a young maid was dismissed from service because she bathed too often. She had made it her practice to wash herself each morning, a habit that might seem ordinary or even admirable. Instead, it was judged offensive. The queen complained that the maid carried the smell of soap wherever she went, and that such a smell was unpleasant and unnecessary. For Victoria, the natural scent of the body was to be valued, while the manufactured fragrance of soap was considered intrusive. This belief turned the normal expectations of cleanliness upside down. Where most households, especially among the wealthy, encouraged frequent washing as a sign of refinement in Victoria's palace, the opposite was true. Cleanliness beyond what the queen practiced herself was unwelcome. To bathe too often was to risk criticism, even punishment. It is almost laughable to think of a palace filled with wealth, where a servant could lose her livelihood simply for smelling of soap. Yet this was the reality of life inside her household. The dismissal of the maid was not a minor event. It became a warning to others. Servants quickly learned that moderation in washing was essential if they wanted to keep their positions. Bathing too frequently might mark them as disobedient or disrespectful. In effect, the queen's personal habits became the law for everyone who lived near her. Servants avoided soap and water more than they might have otherwise, fearful of attracting attention for the wrong reasons. The belief that natural odors were noble extended to the wider environment of the palace. Victoria held that the smell of the body, unmasked by soaps and perfumes, represented authenticity. She disliked artificial scents, except when used sparingly to mask unavoidable odors in her chambers. For her, the body's own presence was a sign of honesty. To servants, however, it was a demand to suppress their own standards of comfort. They were forced to carry the queen's definition of cleanliness into their own lives. The consequences were clear. A palace already heavy with stale air and unwashed fabrics became even less tolerable when those who worked within it avoided soap. The smell of sweat and labor clung to uniforms, aprons, and skin. The effort to keep the queen satisfied created an environment where natural odor accumulated, making the space oppressive. If a workplace today demanded that employees avoid soap and punished them for smelling clean, it would cause outrage and legal battles within days. In the 19th century, within the Queen's palace, it was accepted in silence. For the servants themselves, the dismissal of the maid was both frightening and humiliating. They saw a colleague punished for a habit that many of them secretly wished they could practice. Daily washing was rare among the poor, not by choice, but by necessity. To find themselves in a palace and forbidden to improve their own habits felt like a cruel irony. Instead of offering better conditions, royal service often meant surrendering the few comforts they might have gained. I find it disturbing to imagine being in that position, knowing that a simple act of bathing could be judged an offense strong enough to end a career. The power of one woman's preference outweighed reason, comfort, and health. This dismissal also reflected the tension between modern change and old beliefs. The 19th century was a period of rapid innovation, including advances in sanitation. Public health reformers promoted washing as essential to preventing disease. Yet, at the very center of the empire, the queen herself rejected these ideas. Her influence extended far beyond her own household, shaping attitudes toward cleanliness among those who looked to her as a model. The irony was stark. As Britain prided itself on progress, its monarch clung to a vision of the past. The culture of fear that grew in her palace reinforced obedience. Servants no longer saw bathing as a personal choice. It became a risk. They avoided water, limited their use of soap, and followed routines that mirrored the queen's habits. What might have been personal preference in another home became a strict order in hers. The dismissal of one maid ensured that the rest would fall in line. The palace itself bore the signs of this policy. Corridors and chambers carried the weight of natural odors that were never fully masked. Clothing grew musty more quickly. The air remained thick and unrefreshed. Yet, no one raised the issue openly. To speak against the queen's habits was to challenge her authority, something no servant could afford. Silence again proved stronger than truth. The maid who was dismissed disappeared from the records of the palace. Her story survived only in the accounts of others who remembered what had happened. She became a symbol of the limits placed on those who served. Her fate warned everyone that even the smallest details of hygiene could be judged unacceptable. From that point on, the message was clear. The queen's beliefs came first, and comfort or health came second. Victoria's rejection of soap and her punishment of those who used it created a palace where personal cleanliness was restricted. Servants endured, adapted, and suppressed their own instincts. The queen's view that natural odors were noble became the guiding rule, shaping not only her life but the lives of everyone around her. A maid dismissed for smelling of soap revealed how power reshaped the meaning of cleanliness inside the palace. Her loss became a silent lesson to others, reinforcing neglect as discipline and natural odor as noble. But beyond the servants and their struggles, Victoria's own habits grew even more unsettling when considered during her private times of the month, when her body demanded care that she refused to give. The most private aspects of Queen Victoria's life were governed by the same habits of neglect that marked her daily routines. During her monthly cycle, she did not adopt methods of care that might have limited odor or improved comfort. Instead, she relied on thick cloths folded and pressed against her body to absorb the flow. These cloths were not replaced frequently. They were often worn for an entire day or more before being changed, and the result was an accumulation of blood and sweat that left the fabric heavy and odorous. Only at the end of her cycle were the cloths collected, washed, and reused. Until then, they were hung to dry in private rooms, releasing smells that spread quietly into the surrounding air. The queen treated this as entirely normal. To her, frequent washing or changing was unnecessary and even wasteful. She saw no reason to disturb the body's natural rhythm with what she considered excess. Yet, the consequences of this routine were difficult to ignore. The sheets of her bed grew stained and heavy with odor. The mattress beneath, rarely if ever cleaned, absorbed these odors and held them for months. Servants tasked with changing the bedding noticed the smell immediately. It is almost comical that a palace decorated with gold and jewels contained a bed that smelled less like royalty and more like a neglected sick room. The cloths themselves were coarse and difficult to clean once stained. Boiling or scrubbing left them stiff, but they were still reused. When hung to dry in her chambers, they released a sour metallic odor that clung to curtains and carpets. Servants who handled them were instructed not to comment, though many found the task deeply unpleasant. Carrying the cloths meant carrying the smell, which sometimes followed them long after they left her rooms. They bore this duty in silence, as refusal or complaint would have been treated as disobedience. The presence of these cloths in her private rooms shaped the atmosphere. Combined with unwashed sheets and closed windows, the odor became difficult to disguise. Perfumes were used to mask it, but these only added another layer to the heavy air. Guests who visited never entered such private areas, so they remained unaware. The queen herself accepted the condition as part of life. To her, it was a natural process, requiring no more attention than the occasional drying of cloth. If such practices existed today, It would be like someone refusing all modern sanitary products and instead leaving stained fabric to dry in their bedroom for days at a time. The image makes clear how far her habits were from anything we would consider normal. For the servants, this part of their work was perhaps the most difficult. They were not only required to handle stained cloths, but also to clean the bed after the cycle ended. The sheets were washed infrequently, the mattress never. They carried away linens that smelled strongly of blood and sweat, knowing that much of the odor would remain in the bedding beneath. These tasks, performed without acknowledgement or reward, reminded them daily that royal service meant accepting what could not be spoken. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine standing in such a room with stained cloths hanging to dry and a bed heavy with odor, while being required to treat it all as ordinary. The health risks of these habits were real. Prolonged contact with unwashed cloths could cause infection and irritation. The combination of sweat and bacteria made the risk higher, yet this was not recognized. Medical advice at the time offered little improvement, and the Queen's personal resistance to frequent washing meant that reform was impossible. She trusted her own judgment more than the suggestions of doctors, and so the habits continued unchanged. The palace, heavy with rich fabrics and thick carpets, became a trap for these odors. Unlike stone or wood, fabric absorbed and held the smells of her routines. Curtains hanging near her bed, carpets underfoot, and upholstery in her private rooms all carried traces of her cycle. This created a background odor that servants knew well but outsiders rarely encountered. The contrast between the opulence of the palace and the reality of its smells was another reminder of the gulf between image and truth. The Queen's reliance on cloth rather than more frequent changes reflected her belief in endurance. She saw discomfort as a test of strength. Just as she avoided water and toothbrushes, she avoided what she saw as indulgence in this most private area. To her, discipline meant resisting comfort, even if that comfort meant health and cleanliness. The paradox was that her insistence on discipline created conditions of neglect. For those who worked near her, this discipline meant long days in heavy air. They followed orders, carried cloths, and endured the atmosphere. They had no power to alter the routines. Their silence allowed the habits to persist, just as it had with every other aspect of her hygiene. Victoria's cycles, managed with cloths that were seldom changed and seldom washed, left behind odors that clung to her bed, her chambers, and her servants. To her, this was life. To those around her, it was another burden to endure in silence. The contradiction between wealth and neglect could not have been sharper. The Queen's menstrual habits left her bedding stained, her chambers heavy with odor, and her servants with tasks that no one wanted but all had to perform. She endured these routines with pride in her discipline, convinced they reflected strength. Yet beyond the monthly rituals of cloth and sheet, another practice revealed how neglect extended even to the garments she wore in public, garments that pressed against her body until they grew moldy with sweat. The corset was one of the defining garments of Queen Victoria's appearance, a symbol of the rigid discipline and order that she valued so highly. Worn tightly against her body, it shaped her waist into the fashionable wasp form admired in her time. But behind the polished surface of gowns and jewels, the corset carried with it conditions of neglect that made daily life uncomfortable. The inner lining absorbed sweat and oils each day, pressed firmly against her skin without relief. These linings were not washed or replaced regularly. Instead, they remained in place for weeks, holding the moisture of her body and allowing odor and mold to grow. The tightness of the corset meant that sweat could not evaporate easily. The fabric stayed damp, especially during long ceremonies or warm seasons. Over time, the dampness led to mildew that gave the garment a sour smell. Servants who helped her dress noticed this smell as they tightened the laces, but none spoke of it. They simply carried out their duty, pulling the cords until the Queen's waist was bound once again. It is almost ridiculous that the most powerful woman of her age carried herself proudly in garments that smelled of mildew and sweat, all in the name of fashion. The effect on her skin was significant. Constant pressure combined with trapped moisture caused rashes and irritation along her abdomen and thighs. Red marks remained long after the corset was removed at night. Some records described sores that developed from prolonged wear, but these were dismissed as the natural result of discipline. Victoria herself believed the discomfort was proof of her strength. She saw the pain and irritation as the necessary cost of maintaining the shape demanded by her era. The corset was seldom cleaned properly. Washing would have weakened the stiff materials, and so instead it was aired out briefly before being worn again. This airing did little to remove the smell or the stains. The garment grew darker with use, and the odor grew stronger. Servants folded cloths or sprayed perfumes nearby, but these measures only covered the reality. When the corset was laced back onto her body, the smell returned in full. If a leader today insisted on wearing the same unwashed garment every day for weeks, pressed tightly against the skin until it grew moldy, it would be unthinkable. Yet in the palace, the corset was treated as an instrument of dignity. The process of putting on the corset was itself demanding. Servants pulled the laces until the garment dug deeply into her skin, compressing her waist and restricting her breathing. Combined with the unwashed fabric, this created an oppressive physical experience. The queen endured it daily, convinced that the visible shape it gave her body was worth the cost. To her, the discomfort reinforced her sense of discipline. To her servants, it was another task to perform in silence. Over time, the corset left lasting marks on her body. Discoloration of the skin, sores that took time to heal, and constant redness were common. These problems were never linked to neglect of cleanliness, but rather to the nature of the garment itself. The idea that washing or replacing the lining might have helped was not considered. Instead, the pain was framed as noble. I find it unsettling to imagine a ruler standing in grand ceremonies, admired for her figure, while beneath the gown her skin was raw and burning from a corset that had not been washed in weeks. The contradiction between appearance and reality was stark. To the public, the corset symbolized elegance and order. To those inside the palace, it was a source of odor and discomfort. Servants who helped her dress could smell the mildew and see the marks on her skin, but their silence was mandatory. The corset remained a tool of control, both for the queen herself and for the image she projected to the world. The palace environment amplified the problem. Heavy fabrics of gowns layered over the corset trapped heat and moisture even more. During summer events, the smell of sweat mixed with the mildew of the corset, creating an odor that filled her private chambers. Perfume bottles were used liberally, but they did little to hide the truth. The corset carried its own persistent presence. The queen's belief in the necessity of the corset went beyond fashion. To her, the discipline of wearing it daily reinforced her strength and self-control. She treated discomfort as proof of endurance, turning pain into a form of pride. This belief left no room for concern about cleanliness. The garment was valued for its symbolic meaning, not its physical condition. Servants recorded their unease in private writings. Some described the effort required to lace the corset tightly each day. Others mentioned the odor that rose from the fabric as they leaned close. These testimonies reveal how unpleasant the task was, though no complaint was ever voiced openly. Silence preserved the queen's authority, even in matters as small as a garment. The corset thus became another example of how power transformed neglect into discipline. What might have been considered careless in another household was framed as noble in hers. The unwashed fabric, the smell of mildew, and the sores on her skin were accepted as part of her routine. For the queen, they were reminders of strength. For her servants, they were reminders of silence. The corset of Queen Victoria absorbed sweat, bred mildew, and pressed against her skin until it left marks that never faded. It symbolized the divide between the image of elegance shown to the world and the reality endured within the palace. The garment was as much a prison as it was a symbol of fashion. Her corset, heavy with sweat and mold, left her skin raw, but her pride unshaken. Servants tightened it daily, bearing the smell and the marks it left behind. And if her garments seemed troubling, her most private hygiene revealed an even harsher truth, for she refused to wash the part of her body that most required care. Queen Victoria's attitudes toward hygiene shaped nearly every aspect of her daily life, and nowhere was this more evident than in how she treated the most private areas of her body. She believed that washing those parts directly with water was improper, almost indecent, even when recommended by doctors. In her mind, to touch too often or too thoroughly was a violation of dignity and modesty. This belief did not soften with age or medical advice. It remained firm throughout her reign. Instead of bathing in a way that would have ensured cleanliness, she preferred to wipe herself lightly with cloths dipped in alcohol or scented liquids. These cloths were pressed only to the surface, never used with real attention to the removal of dirt or bacteria. The act was more about maintaining her sense of propriety than about true hygiene. Doctors who tried to advise otherwise found themselves restricted. Male physicians in particular were rarely granted permission to examine her. She disliked the thought of men, even professional doctors, being allowed near her private body. Consent was given only under very limited circumstances, and even then examinations were expected to be brief, with as little contact as possible. The distrust extended to medical tools as well. She refused speculums or other devices, seeing them as unnecessary intrusions. In practice, this meant that opportunities for genuine medical care were almost non-existent. Problems that might have been detected or prevented early were left until they became more serious. It is almost absurd that the ruler of a vast empire could deny herself basic medical care because she thought washing or examination would somehow diminish her dignity. The consequence of her refusal was the gradual buildup of odor and bacteria. Without the regular use of water, sweat and natural secretions accumulate. Bacteria multiply easily in the warmth of unwashed fabric and skin. This led to persistent smells that lingered for years, absorbed into everything around her. The bedding near her carried the odor. Curtains and carpets near her chambers soaked it up as well. Once absorbed into thick fabrics, the smell could not be easily removed. Servants working in her rooms were well aware of it, though they never dared speak of what they noticed. Their silence was as much a rule as their daily tasks. Perfume and scented cloths were used constantly to mask the problem. She preferred dabbing lavender or rosewater on the cloths, believing this to be sufficient. But perfumes only layered another scent over the deeper odor, never removing it. At times this made the air heavier instead of fresher. Guests who came to her private chambers remarked on the thickness of the air, though they rarely identified the source. For those who lived and worked close to her, the cause was obvious. The smell was not fleeting. It became a permanent part of the palace environment. If such a routine existed today, it would be like someone refusing all soap or water for their most private hygiene and simply spraying deodorant or perfume over the smell each day. No one would consider that genuine cleanliness. The burden fell most heavily on the servants. They were tasked with removing the cloths that she had used for wiping and managing bedding that carried the strong, sour odor. These tasks were among the most dreaded. The smell lingered on their hands and clothing after the work was finished. Servants often described in private writings the discomfort of folding such cloths or carrying stained bedding, but they never spoke openly. To comment on such matters would have been considered disrespectful, and disrespect could mean dismissal. I find it disturbing to imagine being one of those attendants, folding cloth stiff with years of use and odor, unable to say a word about what I smelled or felt. It captures the weight of silence imposed by her authority. The health risks of her refusal were significant, though rarely acknowledged. Without proper washing, irritation and infection were almost inevitable. Medical knowledge of the time did not fully understand bacteria, but even basic observation showed the dangers of neglect. Still, Victoria interpreted discomfort as something natural, a test of endurance. If she experienced itching, irritation, or even more serious symptoms, she saw them as private burdens rather than preventable consequences. Doctors, when allowed to observe, often found themselves unable to insist on changes. Her authority outweighed their advice. Victoria's resistance to intimate washing also reflected her wider worldview. She believed that modesty was one of the highest virtues. To her, modesty meant avoiding unnecessary touch, even by herself. What she labeled discipline was, in truth, an excuse to resist change. She prided herself on not indulging in what she considered excessive attention to the body. Hygiene was treated as secondary to morality. This belief shaped not only her personal habits but also the standards of those around her. Servants were expected to follow her example of restraint, and doctors were expected to adapt to her limits. The consequences went beyond her own health. The palace itself bore the mark of her choices. Heavy curtains, padded chairs, and thick carpets absorbed odor that came not only from her lack of washing, but from her other habits as well. Yet this particular smell was especially persistent. Servants used incense and perfumes to cover it, but they never succeeded completely. The palace, grand as it was, carried the hidden truth of its ruler's private neglect. Accounts that survive from servants and attendants show how strongly her authority enforced silence. Some noted privately that the queen's linens and chambers carried smells that could not be mistaken. Others wrote of the discomfort of working in such conditions. But these accounts were always secret. None would have dared say such things while in service. The queen's preferences were treated as unchallengeable law. Over time, the odor became part of the environment in a way that no one could change. The refusal to wash, combined with the refusal to allow medical examinations, made improvement impossible. Servants endured, doctors retreated, and the queen persisted in her convictions. To her it was virtue, to others it was a burden. The contrast between her public image as a symbol of discipline and the reality of her private neglect could not have been greater. Victoria's refusal to wash her most private areas left her body with odors that spread into her surroundings, her servants with tasks that brought discomfort, and her doctors with boundaries they could not cross. Her sense of modesty, framed as dignity, had the opposite effect. It turned her most intimate habits into some of the most disturbing realities of palace life. Her rejection of proper washing, defended as discipline, created odors that clung to her body and her chambers for years. Servants endured the consequences in silence, while doctors stood at a distance, unable to intervene. But one incident broke the silence when a physician who attempted to examine her could not withstand the overwhelming odor and collapsed under the weight of it. The secrecy surrounding Queen Victoria's private hygiene habits was usually maintained by silence, but occasionally the reality broke through. One of the most striking accounts described the day when a physician fainted during an examination. This was not an ordinary doctor's visit. It was an attempt to perform a gynecological check, something already rare due to the Queen's reluctance. The doctor was permitted to begin, but he did not finish. According to the record, the odor and the oppressive atmosphere of the chamber were too much to endure. He staggered, turned pale, and then left abruptly, unable to continue. The incident shocked those present, but the Queen's reaction did not reflect on her habits. Instead, she grew angry that a man would show weakness and make her condition obvious. Victoria's rules about medical care had always been strict. She allowed examinations only with her express permission, and those permissions were given sparingly. Male doctors were always at a disadvantage in such situations. The fainting of one of them confirmed her suspicions that they were not fit for the task. From that day forward, she refused to allow men to take part in her gynecological care. She decreed that only women, and only under certain conditions, could attend to her in this way. It was not a decision based on health, but on pride. It is almost laughable that instead of considering why a physician collapsed, the Queen saw it as proof that men were weak, and that she herself was right to continue her neglect. The physician himself was never named publicly. His story survived in whispers and in the recollections of those who served in the palace. The words used to describe his reaction spoke of a heavy stench and an atmosphere that choked the throat. Servants understood exactly what this meant, for they too had lived in those rooms. But for an outsider, even a professional doctor, the reality came as a shock. The mixture of unwashed bodies, stale cloths, and heavy curtains created an environment that was unbearable to someone not accustomed to it. For a physician trained to endure unpleasantness, to collapse was telling enough. The Queen's anger after the incident was fierce. She took it as a personal insult that a man could not finish his duty in her presence. She did not blame her own habits, nor the odor that filled the chamber. She blamed weakness. Her decision to exclude men from future examinations was final. Afterward, her gynecological care was conducted by female attendants under conditions she tightly controlled. These conditions included dim lighting and the use of gloves made of soft cloth so that examinations felt less invasive. But the real issue remained. The refusal to clean properly made every attempt at medical care more difficult. The incident became a warning to others. Physicians who served her in later years knew the limits they would face. They adjusted their practices, shortened their visits, and worked within her rules. The focus became not on thorough care, but on satisfying the Queen's expectations. This meant that many problems were overlooked or treated superficially. In effect, her authority once again outweighed medical reason. If such an event happened today with a doctor fainting from the odor of a patient, it would likely lead to immediate intervention, serious questions, and changes in treatment. In the Victorian palace, however, the incident was buried under silence and obedience. The servants who witnessed it remembered it quietly. For them, it was further proof of what they already endured. They knew that the Queen's refusal to wash created an environment difficult to tolerate. They had seen it, smelled it, and carried it in the fabrics they cleaned. To see a doctor collapse only confirmed what they had long known, but none of them could speak openly. Silence was the rule, and the incident disappeared from public knowledge. The Queen herself never changed. Instead of reconsidering her choices, she doubled down on them. She treated the physician's collapse as an insult to her dignity, rather than evidence of her own neglect. To her, the incident reinforced her sense of control. She remained convinced that modesty and discipline mattered more than health or cleanliness. The habits that had created the problem were not altered in the slightest. Accounts suggest that after this incident, examinations became even less frequent. When they did occur, the lighting was kept dim. Candles or lamps were turned low to soften the atmosphere. Gloves of fabric, not leather or rubber, were worn by attendants. These conditions made examinations symbolic rather than effective. They reassured the Queen, but did little for her health. The result was neglect disguised as modest care. The symbolism of the fainting doctor was powerful. It showed how even those trained to endure the worst could not ignore the reality of her habits. Yet the lesson was not taken in the way one might expect. Instead of inspiring change, it became another justification for her views. She dismissed men from her private care entirely and continued as she always had. The cycle of neglect went on. I find it unsettling to imagine being in that room, watching a physician falter, knowing exactly why it happened, yet being bound by silence while the Queen insisted she was right. That image captures the depth of denial that surrounded her. The fainting incident also reveals the weight of power in shaping truth. The reality of the Queen's condition was undeniable to those present, but the story never reached the wider world. Instead, it was transformed into another piece of palace secrecy. The public image of Victoria remained untouched, her dignity preserved by silence. Behind the curtains, however, the truth was different. Her reliance on limited female care, performed under dim light with cloth gloves, was not progress, but retreat. It allowed her to maintain her sense of modesty without facing the discomfort of her own neglect. But in the process, it deprived her of the medical care that could have improved her health. The fainting of the doctor had been a warning, but it was not heeded. The collapse of a physician during her examination confirmed what servants had long known and revealed what the Queen refused to admit. It showed the consequences of neglect in the most dramatic way possible. But instead of prompting reform, it led only to stricter rules and deeper secrecy. A doctor fainted. The Queen grew angry, and medical care was restricted even further. The palace adapted to her demands, but the problems remained. And if the collapse of a physician seemed shocking, the truth of her unwashed hair and the way she treated her bedding added yet another layer to the hidden decay of her daily life. The bed of Queen Victoria was not only a place of rest, but also a place where her habits left marks that could not easily be removed. Among the most striking examples was the condition of her pillows. She did not dry her hair after the rare occasions when she washed it. Instead, she let it dry naturally, believing that air drying was healthier and more proper. This meant that night after night, she pressed her damp head onto pillows covered in fine cloth. The moisture sank into the stuffing, mixing with natural oils from her scalp. Over time, the fabric grew stained and the stuffing heavy. The odor that resulted clung to her pillows long after the dampness had dried. Victoria did not see this as a problem. She thought of it as natural, just another part of daily life. The idea of frequently changing or washing pillows did not appeal to her. Once the covers were placed, they often remained for weeks, sometimes longer. During that time, sweat, oil, and dirt accumulated. What might have been a simple matter of hygiene for another person became for her a routine of neglect. It is almost absurd to imagine the queen of a vast empire laying her head each night on pillows soaked with oil and mildew as if her crown made her immune to the smell. Yet this was the reality of her private life. Servants faced the consequences each morning. The smell of stale oil and damp hair lingered in the air around her bed. To mask it, they sprayed scented water or scattered perfumes around the edges of the pillows. These efforts never removed the odor. They only layered another scent over it, creating a mixture of must and flowers that clung to the bedroom. Servants were expected to carry out these tasks silently, never suggesting that the problem came from the queen's refusal to change her habits. The fabric of the pillows grew darker over time. Stains spread outward from where her head rested. The stuffing inside, made of feathers or wool, absorbed oil until it became heavy and clumped together. No amount of shaking could restore its original softness. The smell was so persistent that servants sometimes gagged when moving the pillows, yet no one dared say a word. The queen's rules about cleanliness, or rather her lack of them, were treated as final. If such a routine existed today, it would be like refusing to change a pillowcase for months and letting hair oil seep deep into the stuffing, then masking the smell with perfume sprays. No household would consider that acceptable, yet it remained normal in her palace. The odor from the pillows joined with other smells in the bedroom. Curtains drawn tightly around the bed trapped the air inside. Sweat from her body, odor from her bedding, and oils from her hair all combined to form an atmosphere that was heavy and stifling. Servants entering in the morning described privately the feeling of having something catch in their throats as soon as they stepped inside. The pillows closest to her head contributed the most. Every night they absorbed more, and every morning they released it back into the air. The lack of cleanliness was not without consequences. Oils on the scalp, mixed with dampness from hair that had not been dried, created perfect conditions for irritation. Dandruff and itching were common, but they were treated as natural burdens. Victoria saw no reason to change her practice. To her, it was better to let nature take its course than to fuss with cloths, combs, or drying methods. This belief, repeated often in her routines, reinforced neglect as discipline. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine being the servant responsible for lifting those pillows, inhaling the odor of months-old sweat and oil, while knowing that I could never suggest replacing them. It shows how power shaped even the smallest details of life in the palace. The symbolism of the pillows went further. They represented the contradiction between public and private image. In public, Victoria appeared as the embodiment of order, morality, and royal dignity. In private, she rested her head on pillows that smelled of unwashed hair and stale oil. This contradiction never reached her subjects, but it was lived daily by those who worked closest to her. The silence of servants preserved the image while they endured the truth. The pillows also demonstrated how small neglects could become permanent problems. Once oil soaked into the stuffing, there was no easy way to remove it. Washing was not considered an option. Replacing the pillows would have required acknowledging the issue. Instead, they were left in place, becoming part of the environment. The smell that clung to them became the smell of her chambers, an unavoidable reminder of neglect hidden beneath the surface of grandeur. Victoria's insistence on what she called naturalness was, in practice, a refusal of hygiene. She believed that air-drying her hair and leaving her pillows unchanged showed discipline. In reality, it spread odor and discomfort to everyone around her. The servants who masked the smell each morning knew the truth, but their silence was enforced. They folded the linens, sprayed the perfumes, and kept the queen's secrets. The condition of the Queen's pillows reflected her larger approach to hygiene. It was not limited to hair or bedding. It was part of a pattern that included her refusal to bathe, her unwashed garments, and her reliance on cloths instead of proper washing. Each habit reinforced the others, creating an environment that was both oppressive and unhealthy. Victoria's pillows, soaked with oil and damp from unwashed hair, carried the odor of neglect into every night and every morning. Servants tried to disguise it with sprays and perfumes, but the truth could not be hidden from those who lived within the palace walls. For the Queen, it was ordinary. For those around her, it was another burden endured in silence. Her pillows grew heavy with oil, her chambers filled with scent, and her servants worked each morning to cover what could not be erased. The Queen continued as always, convinced that her way was proper, but the odor of her pillows was only one part of the heavy air in her rooms, for even the walls and curtains themselves began to absorb the smells of her habits. The air inside Queen Victoria's private chambers was shaped not only by her habits of personal neglect, but also by the way her rooms were arranged. The curtains were always drawn, the windows rarely opened, and the space was filled with heavy fabrics that absorbed whatever odors were released into the air. This meant that every practice of hers, especially her use of the chamber pot, left its mark not only on the bedding and floor, but also on the very walls and curtains around her. Servants who entered described the smell as suffocating, a mixture of stale air and ammonia that clung to the throat. One even remarked in private that the walls seemed to breathe along with her, inhaling and exhaling the odor of waste. It was not an exaggeration. The thick fabrics of the room held everything in, making the smell a permanent feature. Victoria refused to allow her windows to be opened without her order. She believed that drafts of fresh air carried illness, and that closing the room protected her health. This belief, common among some Victorians, had the opposite effect. The lack of ventilation meant that ammonia fumes from her chamber pot built up overnight and remained during the day. By morning, when servants arrived to clean, the air was dense with odor. Yet they could not take the simple step of opening a window. That choice belonged to her alone. It is almost absurd that in a palace filled with wealth and power, the Queen's fear of a breeze left her chambers smelling like a locked stable. The fabrics in the room played a major role. Curtains made of velvet or heavy brocade surrounded her bed and lined her windows. Upholstered chairs, cushions, and carpets filled the space. Each of these materials absorbed odors and held them. Ammonia from waste, combined with the smells of sweat and unwashed bedding, sank deep into the fabric. Even when the surface appeared clean, the odor lingered. Servants dusted and sprayed perfumes, but they never removed the deeper problem. The effect grew stronger over time. With each passing day, more fumes were absorbed into the walls and fabrics. The smell became less like something temporary and more like part of the structure itself. Servants noticed that even after thorough cleaning of the chamber pot and removal of bedding, the air of the room still carried the odor. It clung to the curtains most of all. These were drawn tightly around her bed at night, trapping the fumes inside. By morning, when the curtains were opened, the release of air carried a strong wave of ammonia into the room. If such a practice existed today, it would be like someone closing every window, refusing all ventilation, and allowing bathroom odors to seep into their walls until the house itself smelled permanently unclean. No one would tolerate such a condition in modern life. Yet in the palace, it was accepted. The servants responsible for her chambers bore the heaviest burden. They entered each morning to remove the chamber pot, wipe the furniture, and spray scented water around the room. But they knew these were only surface measures. The smell was in the walls, the curtains, and the carpets. They described privately how the odor seemed to follow them out of the chamber, clinging to their clothing and hair long after they left. It was a daily reminder of their duty, a duty that demanded silence. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine being one of those attendants, ordered to clean a room so saturated with waste fumes that even the walls seemed alive with smell, yet being forbidden from taking the simple step of opening a window. The silence must have felt as heavy as the air itself. Victoria herself did not acknowledge the odor. To her, the closed room was a shield. not a prison. She saw the heavy curtains as protection from illness, and the sealed windows as proof of control. She valued the appearance of order, even as the reality was one of suffocating air. Her authority ensured that no one challenged this view. Servants could cough, gag, or turn pale, but they could not complain. The Queen's comfort mattered more than their suffering. The persistence of the odors reflected the larger contradictions of her reign. She ruled over an empire that claimed progress and civilization. Yet her private life was marked by conditions most poor households would have tried to avoid. The palace, decorated with wealth, carried the smell of neglect. This was not a result of poverty, but of belief. Her refusal to accept ventilation and washing meant that the problem remained by choice, not necessity. The condition of her chambers also carried risks beyond discomfort. Prolonged exposure to ammonia fumes can irritate the eyes, lungs, and throat. Servants likely suffered from these effects, though they had no power to demand change. The Queen herself, breathing the same air nightly, may also have experienced irritation, but she interpreted it as natural rather than as something preventable. The habits of neglect were reframed in her mind as discipline, as they were in so many parts of her life. The curtains and walls became silent witnesses to her routines. They absorbed every odor and released it slowly day after day. They were never fully cleaned, never replaced for the sake of freshness. Their beauty remained on the surface, but beneath it lay years of accumulated waste. The contradiction was stark. Velvet embroidered with gold thread smelled of urine, and walls covered in fine fabric carried the scent of neglect. Victoria's refusal to allow ventilation or acknowledge the odor turned her chambers into a place where servants labored each day against a problem they could not solve. Perfumes, incense, and scented water masked it briefly, but the smell always returned. It was part of the room, part of her life, part of the silence that surrounded her habits. Her walls and curtains, saturated with ammonia fumes, stood as reminders of neglect hidden beneath grandeur. The air of her chambers was heavy, the fabrics unclean, and the servants powerless. Yet even as this problem grew, another part of her rooms carried an equally troubling truth, for the very carpets beneath her feet were never washed, only beaten, and they too became carriers of odor that could never be removed. The floors of Queen Victoria's private chambers were covered with thick carpets, chosen for their beauty and their ability to insulate the room. These carpets were woven with rich patterns, heavy threads, and deep piles that spoke of wealth and status. But beneath the appearance of grandeur was another reality. The thickness of the fabric absorbed every odor in the room and held it for years. The chamber pot under her bed released ammonia fumes. The curtains trapped stale air, and her unwashed bedding carried sweat and oil. All of this sank into the carpets, especially in the space beneath and around her bed. With no system of regular washing, the carpets became long-term storage for the smells of her private life. Cleaning the carpets was a restricted process. Servants were allowed to beat the carpets with paddles or rods to release visible dust. They carried them outside on rare occasions or beat them in place, raising clouds of grit that settled back onto the furniture. But they were never permitted to use water. Victoria believed that wetting the carpets would damage them and bring illness into the room. As a result, the odors inside the fabric were never touched. They remained hidden beneath the surface, growing stronger with every passing year. It is almost absurd that in a palace full of luxury, the most powerful woman of her time stepped each day onto carpets that smelled of waste and sweat, yet called it dignity. Servants described how the carpets beneath the bed carried the heaviest smell. This was where the chamber pot sat at night, uncovered and releasing fumes. The air was thickest here, and the fibers of the carpet absorbed it most directly. When servants knelt to clean near the bed, they sometimes gagged from the odor. Yet, they had no choice but to continue. Their orders were to keep the carpets dry, no matter how strong the smell became. Perfumes were used heavily in an attempt to disguise the problem. Bottles of scented water were sprayed across the room each morning. Sometimes carpets were sprinkled with dried herbs or powders to freshen them temporarily. These measures never worked for long. The odor returned within hours, rising from the fibers with every step. Servants learned to live with the smell as part of their duties, even though it clung to their clothes and hair long after they left the chambers. The carpets grew darker with use. Dust, sweat, oils, and perfumes all blended together into a surface that was far from clean. But because they were never washed, they were treated as permanent features of the room. Even when patches wore thin, the smell remained. Visitors who were admitted to the chambers rarely understood what they were breathing. They noticed heavy air, but they did not identify the source. Only those who worked close to the Queen knew how deep the problem went. If the same thing happened today, it would be like covering a bedroom floor with thick rugs, never washing them, only spraying perfume over them, and expecting the smell of waste to disappear. No modern household would accept such neglect. But inside the palace, it was unquestioned. The health effects of these carpets were not small. Dust, trapped within them, irritated lungs and throats. Ammonia fumes mixed with fibers and released slowly, creating constant exposure. Servants often coughed or developed sore throats after cleaning. The Queen herself breathed the same air each night, but she dismissed discomfort as natural. She preferred to believe that her closed rooms were protecting her rather than harming her. For the servants, the carpets were among the most unpleasant duties. They had to kneel on them, beat them, and breathe in the dust and odor. They wrote privately of the difficulty, but they never spoke openly. To question the Queen's orders about cleaning methods would have been seen as disrespectful. The rule was clear: no water, no soaking, only dry beating and perfumes. The smell, no matter how strong, was not to be mentioned. I find it disturbing to imagine working in such conditions, kneeling on a carpet that reeked of ammonia and sweat, forced to beat it daily while pretending it was as fine as the day it was made. That silence shows the weight of authority more than any command could. The carpets also represented the broader contradictions of the Queen's life. They were objects of wealth and beauty, displayed as symbols of royal taste. Yet they smelled of neglect, hidden beneath their patterns. Guests admired their designs, unaware of what they contained. Servants endured their reality, unable to reveal the truth. The divide between appearance and reality was stitched into every thread. The problem only grew with time. After 50 years, the odor in the carpets had become permanent. No amount of perfume, dusting, or beating could remove it. The fibers themselves carried the smell, releasing it slowly into the air. The palace was decorated to impress the eye, but the nose told another story. The truth was hidden, just as so many aspects of the Queen's private life were hidden. The refusal to allow proper cleaning again reflected her beliefs. She thought water brought illness, and so she banned it. She trusted perfumes to mask odor rather than acknowledging that perfumes only added another layer. Her servants were trapped in her rules, unable to do what they knew was necessary. The carpets remained as monuments to neglect, walked upon daily, but never truly clean. Victoria's carpets, especially those near her bed, absorbed years of sweat, ammonia, and dust without ever being washed. Servants beat them, sprayed them, and endured their odor, but they never saw them fresh. To the Queen, they were fine decorations. To those who lived with them, they were carriers of smells that would not die. The carpets, unwashed and heavy with years of odor, remained beneath her feet, part of the silence of the palace. Servants obeyed her orders, masked what they could, and accepted the rest. But if the carpet spoke of hidden neglect, her mouth revealed another story, for even her breath carried an odor that unsettled those closest to her. Queen Victoria's attitude toward her mouth and teeth was as rigid as her rules about the rest of her hygiene. She refused to allow her teeth to be examined openly and was notorious for keeping her mouth closed during medical visits. No one outside her closest circle ever saw her full set of teeth. She considered it improper for men, even doctors, to look directly into her mouth. When dental care was absolutely necessary, she placed severe limits on how it was to be conducted. Dentists were allowed to touch only under strict rules. They had to cover their noses to block the smell and were forbidden from making comments of any kind about what they saw or smelled. The Queen's dignity, in her view, mattered more than truth or health. The condition of her teeth reflected years of neglect. She never brushed them with a proper brush. Instead, she wiped them occasionally with a cloth dipped in strong alcohol. This removed little and left food trapped between her teeth. Over time, decay set in, cavities spread, and her gums grew inflamed. The smell that came from her mouth was unmistakable. Servants who attended her described her breath as sour and metallic, carrying traces of wine, food, and decay. Dentists who worked with her struggled to continue their examinations without recoiling. It is almost absurd that a queen who commanded armies and ruled over continents could not allow a dentist to clean her teeth without first demanding that he cover his nose. The smell of her breath was more than unpleasant. It made examinations difficult to the point of being nearly impossible. Dentists were required to endure it silently, holding cloths or scented handkerchiefs near their faces as they worked. One account even suggested that a dentist once turned his head away mid-examination, unable to face her directly because of the odor. Yet these humiliations did not prompt her to change her habits. She believed that frequent cleaning would weaken her teeth and cause them to fall out. In her view, leaving them alone was a form of protection. The secrecy around her mouth was strict. She often spoke with her lips held tightly, and she avoided smiling widely in public. Portraits of her rarely show her teeth, a detail that reflects her private discomfort. Inside the palace, this secrecy was even more rigid. Doctors were ordered not to write openly about her dental condition, and attendants were told never to comment. Even her family members rarely saw her teeth clearly. It was a part of her body she wanted hidden from view. The irony of this secrecy was that the smell of her breath made hiding impossible. Anyone close to her knew immediately that her mouth was in poor condition. Servants standing near her bed in the morning, doctors leaning close during examinations, even attendants fastening her gowns could smell it. Perfumes could not mask it. The odor was strong, persistent, and deeply unpleasant. If such a case existed today, it would be like a leader refusing all dental care, insisting on secrecy, while their bad breath made every conversation unbearable. No one would tolerate it in public life. Yet in the palace, silence kept the truth buried. Dentists themselves wrote cautious notes about their experiences. They described the queen's refusal to open her mouth fully, her anger when asked to cooperate, and the overwhelming odor that made the work intolerable. One note even recorded her statement that teeth were not meant to be seen by men, as though her modesty outweighed her health. Servants remembered how dentists emerged pale and shaken after visits, some even coughing from the smell they had endured. But none of this reached the public. Her image remained untarnished by the truth of her mouth. The condition of her teeth worsened with time. Untreated cavities spread, gums receded, and discoloration grew more obvious. She endured toothaches that sometimes lasted for days, but she refused extraction or filling. She claimed that foreign metals placed in the mouth would disrupt her body's natural balance. This belief left her with broken and decayed teeth that never healed. The pain was constant, but she bore it as part of what she considered discipline. For the servants, her breath became another burden. They could not avoid it when helping her dress, standing beside her chair, or attending her in bed. The odor clung to the room, mixing with other smells already present. They endured it silently, as they endured everything else. I find it unsettling to imagine being in such close quarters, forced to endure the sour, metallic breath of a monarch while pretending nothing was wrong. The thought captures both the weight of her authority and the cost of silence. The queen's refusal to address her dental hygiene was consistent with her broader approach to cleanliness. She rejected modern practices, clung to beliefs that comforted her pride, and ignored the consequences. Her dignity in her mind was worth more than her health. The secrecy around her mouth became symbolic of the secrecy around her entire life. Outwardly, she projected order and strength. Inwardly, she endured decay. Her dentists, bound by rules and overwhelmed by odor, could do little more than attend briefly and retreat. Servants continued their tasks, bearing the smell in silence. The queen continued to insist that nothing was wrong. The cycle of neglect persisted just as it had in every other part of her life. Her hidden teeth, her overpowering breath, and her refusal of care revealed the contradictions between public image and private truth. She kept her mouth closed, but the smell betrayed her. She demanded silence, but her breath spoke louder than words. Her refusal to reveal her teeth and her demand that dentists work in silence left her with broken, decayed, and painful gums. The smell of her breath filled her chambers, driving even professionals to turn away. But if her mouth revealed neglect, the rest of her teeth told an even darker story, for they were left discolored, broken, and untreated, carrying years of decay without repair. The state of Queen Victoria's teeth grew worse as the years passed, and yet she refused to take any of the measures that could have slowed their decline. Cavities spread across her molars, cracks formed along the enamel, and pieces of teeth chipped away. Instead of seeking fillings or repairs, she insisted that leaving the damage untreated was better for her health. She feared that inserting metal into her mouth would interfere with her body's natural balance. Some accounts even suggest she believed metals would drain her energy, weakening her vitality. For that reason, broken teeth were left jagged, darkened, and painful, but never treated with the tools dentists had available. This refusal meant that her teeth became visibly discolored. They shifted from pale yellow to brown and then to black along the edges. Cavities deepened until they were visible when she opened her mouth to speak, yet she still resisted modern treatments. Fillings, which were becoming more common at the time, were dismissed outright. To her, they were unnatural. Dentists were instructed not to suggest them, and if they did, they were silenced quickly. The Queen preferred to suffer in silence rather than adopt what she saw as intrusive methods. It is almost absurd to imagine the monarch of the British Empire refusing dental fillings because she thought a tiny piece of metal would steal her life force. Instead of mint-based solutions, which might have helped with odor, she avoided them as well. She disliked the strong, cooling taste of peppermint or spearmint, claiming it was unnatural and too harsh. Mint mouthwashes, beginning to appear in Britain during her reign, never touched her lips. Instead, she rinsed her mouth occasionally with strong alcohol or with black tea. Neither method offered real protection. Alcohol burned but did not clean effectively, while tea left tannins that only stained her teeth further. Over time, her reliance on these substitutes worsened her condition rather than improving it. Dentists who attended her found themselves limited at every step. They could not fill, they could not clean deeply, and they could not recommend solutions she disliked. Their role became ceremonial rather than medical. They checked briefly, touched lightly, and retreated as quickly as possible. Any suggestion of stronger measures risked angering her. In practice, her dental care was no care at all. Cavities widened, cracks spread, and discoloration deepened. Her gums became inflamed and often bled when she chewed. The Queen's refusal to allow real dental care not only affected her health, it also affected those around her. Her breath, already foul from lack of brushing, grew worse as her teeth decayed further. Servants close to her described an odor of rot mixed with alcohol and tea. Dentists found themselves forced to cover their noses during brief examinations, a rule she herself allowed so long as they never commented. The smell became part of her presence, unavoidable to anyone who came near her. If such habits existed today, it would be like someone refusing all dental treatment, avoiding toothpaste, rinsing only with whiskey, and then wondering why their teeth were black and crumbling. The absurdity makes clear how far her habits strayed from reason. The effect on her appearance was another matter. Portraits of the Queen rarely show her teeth, and this was deliberate. She disliked smiling openly and avoided revealing her mouth in public. The secrecy around her dental state was part of her larger secrecy about hygiene. Servants saw the reality daily, but the public never did. The contrast between her image as a strong, dignified ruler and the truth of her failing teeth was hidden carefully. Only in private writings and later accounts did the truth emerge. The pain of her condition must have been constant. Decayed teeth often lead to infections and nerve pain, but Victoria bore them as burdens of discipline. She prided herself on endurance, believing that suffering proved her strength. Instead of seeking relief, she reframed the pain as a noble trial. This belief reflected her wider view of hygiene as well. Discomfort was not something to be prevented, but something to be endured as a sign of self-control. I find it unsettling to imagine her sitting through long state meetings, her mouth aching with untreated decay, her breath filling the air, yet her pride leaving her unwilling to accept even the simplest treatment. It is a picture of discipline that disguised neglect for her servants and attendants. The state of her teeth created another daily burden. They stood near her during meals, smelling the odor of rotting food caught in broken teeth. They helped her prepare for bed, smelling the same odor as she spoke. Dentists endured examinations that solved nothing, returning again and again to face the same conditions. The silence required of them was as heavy as the stench itself. The Queen's rejection of fillings and proper rinses reflected her broader rejection of progress. The 19th century saw advances in sanitation, medicine, and public health. Yet the monarch of Britain rejected these advances in her private life. She clung to her own beliefs, even when they left her in pain and discomfort. Her authority allowed her to do so without challenge. What would have been criticized in others was accepted in her because of who she was. Her teeth, left untreated, symbolized more than just neglect. They symbolized the contradictions of her reign. A ruler who presided over an empire that celebrated progress lived privately in decay. A woman who was a symbol of order and morality hid teeth that were broken, black, and foul. The secrecy surrounding them protected her image, but it did not change the truth. Her refusal to fill cavities, her dislike of mint, and her reliance on tea and alcohol left her with teeth that crumbled slowly over time. Servants endured the smell, dentists endured the limits, and the Queen endured the pain. To her, it was strength. To others, it was silence. Her teeth, broken and blackened, became another mark of her neglect. They represented her pride, her fear of progress, and her insistence on discipline over comfort. But if her mouth was a source of odor and secrecy, the very bed she lay upon revealed another problem just as troubling, for the sheets and mattresses beneath her body were left unwashed for years. The bed of Queen Victoria was a central piece of her life, a place where she spent long hours writing letters, receiving visitors, and sleeping under heavy curtains. But while the surface of the bed looked regal, the truth beneath it told a different story. The thick mattress was never properly cleaned. Instead, only the sheets and covers on top were changed, and even those were replaced at long intervals. The mattress itself absorbed sweat, oils, and odor from her body every night. Over the years, it became saturated with what could never be removed. Servants who carried or lifted the mattress wrote privately of the smell, describing it as overpowering, almost intoxicating in its heaviness. Victoria believed that frequent washing of bedding was unnecessary. She considered it disruptive and thought that mattresses, being too large and difficult to move, did not require attention. Instead, her servants were instructed to change only the outer layers, such as the sheets or the blanket covers. The mattress remained untouched year after year. With each night's sleep, more sweat and odor sank into its stuffing. It grew heavier, darker, and fouler with age. It is almost absurd that a queen who commanded the greatest empire of her time chose to rest on a mattress that smelled worse than the beds of the poorest tenements. The thickness of the mattress made the problem worse. It was stuffed with feathers and horsehair, materials that absorbed moisture easily. Each night her body heat pressed sweat deep into the layers. Once inside, it never dried completely. The result was a permanent dampness that grew sour over time. Perfume sprays and powders were used each morning to mask the odor, but these only added another layer of scent. The underlying problem was never addressed. Servants dreaded the days when the bedding had to be stripped. Lifting the sheets revealed stains that had spread into the mattress itself. When the mattress was moved, the smell released into the air was so strong that one servant later wrote he thought he would faint. Another described the odor as the breath of the room, as if the mattress itself exhaled years of neglect. Yet these experiences were never spoken of openly. To criticize the Queen's habits was unthinkable. Silence was part of their duty. The Queen's refusal to allow her mattress to be cleaned reflected her larger beliefs about hygiene. She distrusted water, disliked disruption, and saw discipline in endurance. To her, a mattress was a piece of furniture, not a part of hygiene. Changing sheets was enough. The deeper layers did not matter. This belief ignored the reality of what her body left behind each night. If someone today slept for years on the same unwashed mattress, changing only the sheets while letting sweat soak deeper and deeper, the smell would drive them out of their own room. For Victoria, it became part of daily life. The odor of the mattress filled her chambers. Curtains drawn tightly around the bed trapped the smell inside. Each morning, when the curtains were opened, the air released was heavy with ammonia, sweat, and perfume. Servants tried to refresh the room with incense, but it never lasted. The mattress remained the source, unmovable and untouched. Over time, the smell became so persistent that servants noticed it clung to their clothes after working in the room. Health risks were unavoidable. A mattress filled with sweat and dampness provided a breeding ground for bacteria and insects. It caused skin irritation and contributed to respiratory discomfort. Servants who handled it described coughing, sneezing, and sore throats. The Queen herself likely experienced irritation, but she dismissed it as natural. Her belief that discipline meant resisting comfort blinded her to the consequences of neglect. I find it unsettling to imagine lying each night on a mattress so saturated with sweat and odor that servants described it as intoxicating, yet still believing it was dignified. The contradiction between luxury and reality could not have been clearer. The secrecy around the mattress matched the secrecy around her other habits. Outsiders never saw it, never smelled it, and never heard of it. Portraits and descriptions of her chambers spoke of elegance, not odor. The truth remained hidden within the palace walls, endured only by those who served her directly. Once again, the gap between public image and private reality was vast. The mattress also symbolized how small neglects accumulated into something permanent. What began as a simple choice not to clean grew over decades into a piece of furniture that carried the odor of her entire reign. No amount of perfume could erase it. No sheet could fully cover it. The mattress became a silent witness to her habits, an object that preserved years of sweat and decay. The servants bore the greatest cost. They were the ones who lifted the mattress, stripped the sheets, and endured the smell. They were also the ones who knew the truth most clearly, yet their voices were never heard. The Queen's authority silenced them. Their duty demanded endurance, just as her beliefs demanded neglect. The Queen's mattress, heavy with sweat and foul with age, revealed the truth of her hygiene in a way that no words could. It was the hidden center of her chambers, a private object that carried public meaning. It showed how wealth and power could disguise neglect, but never erase it. The mattress told the truth even when no one else could. Her mattress, left unwashed and unchanged, became a monument to neglect hidden beneath the appearance of grandeur. Servants endured its odor. The Queen dismissed its risks, and the palace itself absorbed its smell. But if her mattress carried the burden of her neglect at night, the garments she wore in the evening carried another truth. For even her nightgowns were never washed as they should have been. The nightgowns of Queen Victoria were not ordinary garments. They were made of heavy silk and fine fabrics chosen to reflect status. But they quickly became part of her long list of unhygienic habits. Each evening she wore them for hours in rooms sealed against fresh air. The gowns absorbed her body's sweat, the oils of her skin, and the thick perfume sprayed generously on her before sleep. In the morning, rather than being washed, they were carefully removed by servants and placed over a chair near a window. The sun or air was expected to freshen them, but washing was rare. For Victoria, airing the garment was enough. Over the years, these nightgowns became stiff with residue and marked with discoloration. They carried the smell of her body and the heavy mix of perfume layered on top. The belief behind this practice was consistent with her wider distrust of cleaning. She thought constant laundering would damage the silk and considered soap and water unnecessary. In her mind, the fabric only needed to be preserved, not scrubbed. The result was a collection of garments that grew foul with use, but remained in rotation. It is almost absurd that the Queen of the British Empire slept in clothing that smelled worse each week, while her subjects were expected to admire her as a symbol of dignity. This contradiction showed how appearances meant more than reality in her household. Servants described the condition of these gowns in private notes. After only a few days of wear, the silk grew dark at the armpits and chest, where sweat was heaviest. The fabric lost its softness, becoming stiff where perfume and oil mixed together. By the end of a week, the smell was strong enough that servants hesitated to handle the garments. Yet, they were forbidden to wash them unless given explicit orders. Instead, they were folded, hung, or refolded, with the odor lingering in the air around them. The gowns became what some called a map of smells. Each layer of fabric told the story of nights spent in sealed rooms. Oils formed stains in some places, perfume clung to others, and sweat patches created permanent marks. The garments stopped being soft symbols of royalty, and instead became heavy, stiff reminders of neglect for the servants tasked with handling them. This was humiliating work. They had to hold their breath while folding silk meant for a queen. Over time, the accumulation of these garments created storage problems. Wardrobes held not only new silk gowns, but also layers of old ones that had never been washed. The smell of stale fabric spread into cupboards and trunks. For the palace staff, this became yet another task that carried discomfort. They sprayed perfumes into the wardrobes, but this only created stronger combinations of odor. The smell was never removed, only covered. If compared to modern habits, it would be like someone today wearing the same pajamas every night for months, sweating into them constantly, then hanging them on a chair to reuse without ever washing. The thought is disturbing. Yet, this was the routine in the royal household. While society outside was beginning to embrace the idea of sanitation and cleanliness, the Queen's own choices moved in the opposite direction. The health consequences were also real. Wearing unwashed clothing against the skin increases the risk of rashes, infections, and irritation. Victoria reportedly suffered from frequent skin problems, especially on her torso and underarms. Servants wrote that she often complained of itching, though she didn't connect it to her clothes. Doctors who treated her rarely dared to suggest that hygiene was the cause. Silence around the Queen's habits was enforced strictly. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine these nightgowns stiffening with layers of sweat and perfume, turning into a daily source of irritation, yet still being worn proudly by the monarch. The thought of servants folding and refolding such garments, never allowed to clean them, adds another layer of discomfort to the story. The symbolism of the gowns was unmistakable. On the outside, they looked elegant, reflecting wealth and class. Up close, they told a different story. They revealed the neglect hidden beneath the surface of royalty. They carried smells that no amount of perfume could hide. Servants dreaded touching them, but the Queen insisted on keeping her habits unchanged. For the palace, the problem extended beyond her personal discomfort. These garments contributed to the general odor of her chambers. Hung on chairs or stored in cupboards, they released smells into the air. Combined with the unwashed bedding and closed curtains, they created an environment that was suffocating. Servants who entered the bedroom each morning felt overwhelmed. Some wrote later that the odor clung to their hair even after they left. The nightgowns became symbols of a pattern. Rather than removing dirt or odor, the Queen simply layered more perfumes or oils on top. The result was not freshness, but intensity. Her chambers smelled not of elegance, but of a heavy mixture of rot and flowers. The more she avoided washing, the worse the problem became. Servants knew it, but silence was demanded. The accumulation of years left its mark. Old gowns, stiff with oil and sweat, were stored away rather than discarded. They became relics of her habits, preserved not by choice, but by neglect. Even after her death, some garments retained traces of odor, reminding those who handled them of the truth behind her life. The story of her nightgowns is not simply about clothing. It is about a refusal to accept the simplest forms of hygiene. It is about power creating silence around habits that harmed not only the Queen but those forced to live in her environment. It is about how appearances hid truths, and how those truths eventually revealed themselves in more damaging ways. The Queen's nightgowns, worn night after night without washing, reflected her reign in miniature. They were elegant on the outside, but foul in reality. They were preserved for dignity, but they carried discomfort and odor. They symbolized how power can ignore reality but not escape it. In the end, these garments carried more than fabric. They carried the truth of her habits, her neglect, and her refusal to change. They left behind smells that no perfume could erase. They reminded her servants daily of what silence forced them to endure. The nightgowns of Queen Victoria, stiff with layers of sweat, oil, and perfume, tell us more than any public record. They show how her choices shaped her body, her servants, and her palace. They reveal how the Queen herself lived in conditions she dismissed as normal, but which others found unbearable. The story of these garments is one more piece of evidence that her hygiene shaped her legacy. They remained in her chambers, in her wardrobes, and even in museums, carrying faint traces of what they once absorbed. They remind us that history is not only about laws and battles, but also about the hidden details of daily life. The nightgowns of Queen Victoria became a map of her neglect, preserving the smells and stains of years of refusal to change. They filled her chambers with odor, burdened her servants, and symbolized her rejection of modern cleanliness. And when her body finally gave out, those habits revealed themselves in the most shocking way, leaving even death unable to escape the price of her choices. When Queen Victoria's life ended, the habits she had carried for decades left a final mark that no one could disguise. The years of sweat-soaked nightgowns, unwashed bedding, and sealed chambers had allowed bacteria to flourish close to her body. These were not fleeting conditions. They were accumulations that shaped the state of her health in life and became evident once she died. In less than 2 days after her final breath, her body showed signs of decomposition at a pace that shocked the doctors assigned to prepare her remains. The embalming process, normally effective for preserving a royal corpse, was no match for what her tissues had absorbed across a lifetime. Accounts described the odor as overwhelming. Physicians had expected the usual solemn duties, but they found themselves surrounded by a stench that rose quickly and filled the chamber. The closed curtains and thick fabrics of her room trapped the gases that her body released. For men who had handled other royal corpses, the difference was striking. The Queen's body, unlike those of her predecessors, did not yield easily to preservation. The work of sealing her dignity became a race against time. It is grimly ironic that a woman who avoided washing for fear of weakness produced a corpse that weakened the very men tasked with guarding her image. The speed of decay was interpreted as the outcome of long neglect. Her skin had been covered for years in layers of oil, sweat, and fabric that allowed bacteria to thrive. The very practices she believed preserved her strength became the foundation for her rapid breakdown in death. Within hours, the smell reached through the corridors. Servants whispered that they could not remain in the chamber without covering their faces. The doctors, trained to endure difficult conditions, admitted they were overwhelmed. The decision to hold the funeral quickly was not simply about schedule or protocol, it was about concealment. Authorities knew that news of a decaying body would cause embarrassment for the monarchy. The public image of Victoria had to remain one of discipline and grandeur. To admit that her body betrayed her so soon after death would open the door to ridicule. The solution was haste. Her coffin was sealed, the services arranged without delay, and her remains placed out of reach of curious witnesses. Behind the scenes, servants bore the brunt of the work. They prepared her clothing, arranged the room, and attempted to mask odors with perfumes and flowers. These efforts did little. Perfume added sweetness, but the heavy smell of decomposition pierced through. The air became dense, pressing on the lungs of those who entered. Even her closest family members limited their time near the coffin. They appeared for duty, bowed their heads, and left as quickly as possible. If we imagine such a scene today, it would be like trying to conduct a state funeral in a room where industrial waste had been spilled, forcing mourners to stand stiff while fighting nausea. The gap between dignity and reality could not have been wider. Medical men noted details in their journals. They blamed her lifetime of poor hygiene for the speed of the process. They whispered of gases accumulated by years of closed fabric and tissues, softened by constant exposure to filth. Though these notes were not meant for the public, they circulated privately, shaping how insiders remembered her final days. To them, her rapid decomposition was not a mystery. It was the logical conclusion of decades of neglect. For the monarchy, this was a dangerous truth. Royalty had always been surrounded by ceremony to hide the body's weakness. Death was supposed to show majesty preserved beyond the grave. Victoria's death showed the opposite. Her corpse decayed with shocking speed, betraying the reality she had kept behind curtains during life. The fact that officials rushed her burial is a testament to their fear of scandal. I cannot help but think of the contrast between the monuments built to honor her and the foul air that filled her chamber as she lay dead. The empire wanted permanence, but her body gave them only urgency. The silence around her habits during life became a silence about her death. No one dared to speak openly of the odor, but those who were present never forgot it. This event closed the circle of her existence. In life, she resisted water and clung to fabrics that trapped sweat and perfume. In death, those same choices betrayed her, allowing bacteria to announce themselves before her memory could be shaped by ceremony. The final act of her reign was not speeches or processions, but the smell of decay that forced everyone to hurry. For those closest to her, the experience was haunting. Servants who had endured her rooms for years now faced the most intense version of what they had always known. The odor of the Queen's body, stronger than anything before, marked them. Some later wrote of being unable to rid themselves of the smell, as though it clung to their hair and skin for weeks. Doctors who prided themselves on control admitted that they had been shaken. The Queen had become unmanageable even in death. The body of Victoria, once paraded as the symbol of an empire, had collapsed into a reminder of human frailty. Her refusal to embrace simple hygiene practices had left her body vulnerable to a rapid decline that no title could prevent. The silence of her court could not hide it. The flowers laid around her coffin only emphasized the contrast between intended fragrance and unavoidable rot. Her funeral passed quickly, her coffin sealed before the public could sense the truth. Speeches were given, hymns were sung, and the empire mourned. Yet for those who had been in the chamber during those first hours, the memory was not of glory, but of a smell that seemed to erase the distance between life and death. The lesson of her death was not spoken aloud. It was buried with her, left to linger in the notes of doctors and the whispers of servants. But it stood as a stark reminder that power cannot erase the consequences of neglect. The Queen's body, like her garments and her chambers, carried the marks of her refusal to change. The final days of Victoria revealed the ultimate cost of her lifetime of habits, with her body decaying faster than anyone expected, forcing even her doctors into retreat. Her funeral became a race against odor, a desperate attempt to preserve dignity where dignity had already failed. What lingered afterward was not only the memory of her reign, but the unease of those who had stood near her coffin. In the last days surrounding Queen Victoria's death, the routines of her household staff took on a darker weight. Preparing the body for burial, dressing it in layers of ceremonial cloth, and arranging it for the vigil were duties expected of loyal servants. Yet these duties became a punishment in themselves, because the smell of rapid decay was impossible to escape. The women assigned to handle her corpse worked in silence, faces pale, cloths pressed to their mouths. Some fainted, others had to be led out of the room, unable to continue. For them, loyalty meant enduring an atmosphere that clung to every breath. Descriptions left behind show how unbearable the task became. Servants wrote in private notes about the sensation of the odor seeping into their hair and clothes. Even after leaving the chamber, they reported that the smell lingered for days, as though it had marked them. Some confessed to scrubbing themselves over and over, yet nothing removed the memory of that stench. The experience was not simply physical, it was psychological. They felt contaminated by association, victims of their proximity to the Queen's body. It is almost comical in the darkest sense that while the empire boasted of her majesty, her closest attendants were reduced to fighting nausea beside her coffin. Family members were not exempt, though they had more freedom to distance themselves. Her children came to pay respects, bowed their heads, and quickly retreated. None chose to stay in the chamber for long, even during the official vigils. They left those tasks to attendants who were expected to remain near the body for hours. It is telling that even those bound by blood kept their visits short, unwilling to sleep under the same roof as the corpse. The smell, according to their writings, was oppressive. They could not reconcile their grief with the air that surrounded them. The staff bore the weight most heavily. The rituals of mourning demanded that the Queen's body be kept presentable, yet nothing they did could hide what nature had already begun. Perfumed oils were applied to the burial cloths. Flowers were placed in large arrangements, and incense was burned. None of these efforts covered the odor. If anything, the mixture created a heavier, more confusing scent that pressed on lungs and throats. Women charged with adjusting the Queen's garments often came away dizzy. Some later admitted to avoiding food because nausea had consumed them during those days. The experience reached into the minds of those who stayed in the palace. They later recalled an invisible presence that followed them even after they left the building. One servant wrote that the smell clung to her hair so strongly she could smell it while lying in bed at home. It haunted her dreams, mixing with the sound of church bells and funeral hymns. For weeks, she felt as though the Queen's final presence still surrounded her, not as a memory of grandeur, but as a sensory burden she could not shake. If we draw a comparison to modern times, it would be as though staff at a state funeral had to endure toxic fumes that stain their clothes and refuse to wash out, a detail no public broadcast would ever reveal. These burdens reveal how the Queen's habits touched those around her even after death. The lack of hygiene that shaped her life created consequences for her staff, forcing them to bear physical and emotional suffering in her final chapter. They had no choice. Service meant submission, even to the realities of decomposition. For the monarchy, these details were hidden behind ceremony, but for those present, it was unforgettable. The Queen's children and grandchildren avoided the ordeal of remaining near the body for long periods. Their distance was a privilege of status. They could step out, leave the building, and return only for appearances. The staff had no such privilege. Their duty chained them to the smell, to the garments, and to the coffin itself. Their journals tell a story not of solemn mourning, but of exhaustion and disgust. I cannot avoid noticing how the people who served her most faithfully were also the ones who suffered most deeply from the decay she left behind. The irony is sharp. The Queen, who valued loyalty and duty above all, left her household trapped in tasks that scarred their memories. They became, in effect, her final victims. The days following her burial did not bring quick relief. Some staff members resigned soon after, unwilling to remain in a place that carried such memories. Others stayed, but spoke of the lingering odor in the palace halls. For them, the event confirmed something they had long suspected, but never voiced aloud: that the habits of the Queen had made life harder, not only for herself, but for everyone near her. The speed of decomposition and the intensity of the odor forced everyone to confront truths that had long been hidden behind closed doors. Her avoidance of washing, her love of sealed rooms, and her indifference to hygiene, all culminated in this moment. The servants who endured those days bore the evidence in their memories, while her children chose distance and silence. The funeral itself went forward with pomp and solemnity. To the public, it was a dignified farewell to a monarch who had ruled for decades. But behind the closed doors of the palace, the reality was very different. Staff whispered of nausea, of hair that smelled even after washing, of garments that had to be discarded. These are not details found in official histories, but they show the hidden cost of service to a queen who had lived with disregard for cleanliness. Her attendants became unwilling witnesses to the final consequence of a lifetime of habits. They endured days in an atmosphere thick with decay, performing duties that left them shaken and marked. Their loyalty was tested in a way the public never saw. The servants who stayed near Victoria's body carried her final odor with them, a reminder of the burden of loyalty in the face of unbearable conditions. Her children kept their distance, but her staff had no such escape, leaving them the last to suffer from her lifetime of neglect. And while the funeral ended her reign, the palace itself still held traces that no ceremony could entirely remove. After Queen Victoria's death, the task of modernizing Buckingham Palace moved forward. New toilets with flushing systems were installed. New ventilation methods were tested, and windows were opened more frequently. Yet, none of these measures could fully erase the layers of odor that had built up during her lifetime. The heavy curtains, the thick carpets, and the upholstery of her personal rooms had absorbed years of sweat, perfume, and waste. The smell clung stubbornly, as though the palace itself had become a vessel of her habits. Staff tasked with cleaning after her reign described the experience in terms that sounded less like housekeeping and more like excavation. When curtains were pulled down, they carried a faint, sour heaviness that no amount of beating or sunlight could banish. Carpets rolled up for replacement released a trapped staleness that filled the entire corridors. The furniture, even when polished, held a faint trace of human musk, mixed with damp. It is strangely funny that a palace symbolizing imperial grandeur could also smell like a second-hand shop that had never seen fresh air. Visitors in later decades reported similar impressions. While official tours and royal ceremonies highlighted the splendor of architecture, those who worked in close proximity knew another reality. Servants whispered about certain rooms where the air always felt heavier, even after years had passed. They said the fabrics had memories, that the fibers themselves held on to the life that had filled them. To them, the presence of Victoria was not in portraits or statues, but in the smell embedded in the palace walls. Historians have noted that some of her personal belongings, preserved as artifacts, carried those same qualities. Dresses stored in chests were described as stiff with old oils. Gloves bore traces of the perfume that once masked but never replaced her natural odor. Even objects intended for display, such as jewelry cases lined with velvet, seemed to hold an undercurrent of dampness. Curators at museums later admitted quietly that certain items came with what they called the atmosphere of the past, a polite phrase for decay. Efforts to air out the palace brought little success. The building itself had been closed for too long, and the fabrics were too deeply saturated. Servants scrubbed, polished, and replaced, but the sense of heaviness never completely disappeared. New monarchs brought new furnishings. Yet even those additions became tainted when placed in the same environment. It was as if the very air of the palace had been conditioned to carry her legacy. If we think of this in present-day terms, it would be like moving into a newly renovated house, only to find that the smell of mold from decades before still lingers in the walls, no matter how much paint is added. The persistence of these odors shows how physical environments absorb and reflect human life. Victoria's refusal to embrace cleanliness not only affected her body, but also her attendants. It shaped the condition of the palace itself. Her presence became inseparable from the objects around her. Even after her death, those objects spoke of her through smell, a language impossible to display in portraits or written records. I find it unsettling to imagine museum visitors staring at her belongings, while curators privately note the lingering hints of sweat and dampness. These are details rarely spoken about, yet they bring history uncomfortably close. They remind us that rulers were not only figures of ceremony, but also bodies that left marks on their surroundings. The survival of these traces also explains why accounts from her time emphasized secrecy. Officials were careful about what was written and what was spoken publicly. They knew that to acknowledge the odor would diminish the image of imperial majesty. Instead, the palace carried on, its grandeur intact in the eyes of the world, while those inside lived with the contradiction of beauty layered over decay. In this way, Buckingham Palace became more than a symbol of the empire. It became a container of unspoken truths. Beneath the polished surfaces and state ceremonies, there lay fabrics that remembered too much. To walk its halls was to breathe in not just history, but residue. The invisible record of a queen's private life made permanent. The palace's transformation could not erase the traces of Victoria's habits, with curtains, carpets, and objects still bearing the weight of her neglect. Her presence remained not in marble statues, but in the persistent odor that refused to leave. What came after was the recognition that even her throne carried a legacy no one wanted to name. Queen Victoria's reign stretched across nearly a century. a time when Britain grew into a global empire that touched every continent of the world. She stood as a figure of discipline, family values, and national pride. Statues were raised in her honor, streets were named after her, and her face appeared on coins that traveled through the hands of millions. Yet within her private world, the habits she carried left a very different legacy. Her body and her surroundings were marked by neglect, and that neglect shaped the way she was remembered by those who lived closest to her. It was not the grandeur of parades or speeches that lingered in their memory, but the odor that clung to her chambers and her belongings. In her personal rooms, fabrics held layers of sweat, perfume, and stale air. These were not simple details that vanished with time. Even after her death, the curtains and carpets were said to carry the heaviness of years without fresh air or proper cleaning. Furniture absorbed her presence in ways that no polish could undo. Servants who handled her clothes described them as stiff with oils and dampness, and these garments were stored rather than washed. When visitors later entered those rooms, some reported that the air itself seemed different, heavier, as though it carried the memory of the Queen. It almost feels absurd that the symbol of the British Empire lived surrounded by smells that would embarrass even the smallest inn. This contradiction between image and reality became more visible after her death. The speed of decomposition, the struggles of her attendants, and the odor that filled her final chamber made it clear that her private habits had lasting consequences. Doctors who worked with her body noted that bacteria had thrived in her tissues, hastening decay. Servants who stood vigil wrote in their diaries about nausea and exhaustion. Her children, though loyal, avoided long hours near her coffin. Publicly, the empire presented the funeral as dignified and solemn. Privately, those involved remembered the oppressive air and the race to bury her before scandal could spread. Even Buckingham Palace, a symbol of state power, bore the marks of her life. Upgrades such as flush toilets and improved ventilation could not erase what had already been absorbed. Curtains, carpets, and upholstery carried traces that persisted long after her passing. Objects preserved for display, such as dresses and gloves, were reported to have a faint but undeniable heaviness, a reminder of the body that once wore them. Museum staff quietly admitted that some items still seemed to hold the atmosphere of the past. If we compare this to today, it would be like entering a presidential residence renovated with modern systems, but still smelling faintly of garbage left decades earlier. What makes this story striking is not only the physical evidence, but the silence that surrounded it. Publicly, her reign was celebrated as one of progress and moral order. The empire prided itself on discipline and cleanliness. Yet, the Queen herself resisted basic hygiene. Her refusal to wash regularly, her dependence on fabrics that trapped sweat, and her use of perfumes to mask odor were known to her staff, but rarely spoken of outside palace walls. Those who served her carried the burden of this silence, enduring conditions that clashed with the empire's ideals. I think the detail that disturbs me most is how her attendants became unwilling witnesses to this hidden truth, bound by loyalty to endure what no one dared to admit aloud. Their memories tell us more than official histories ever could. They reveal the cost of silence, the weight of service, and the gap between public image and private reality. Her legacy then was twofold. To the world, she was the mother of the empire, guiding Britain through industrial expansion and global influence. To those within the palace, she was a figure surrounded by odor and neglect. Both truths existed at once, and together they form a fuller picture of her reign. It was not only her policies and her image that shaped history, but also the traces she left behind in fabrics, furniture, and the very air of Buckingham Palace. The persistence of these details challenges the way we think about history. We often imagine rulers as distant, preserved in marble or bronze, untouched by the ordinary realities of the body. Yet, Victoria's story reminds us that even the most powerful figure cannot escape those realities. Her habits shaped not only her health, but also the experience of everyone around her. They became part of the palace itself, a hidden inheritance that lingered long after her crown was passed to another. In the end, Queen Victoria's reign left monuments, laws, and cultural traditions that shaped the modern world. But it also left something less visible: and far less celebrated. The memory of a smell that refused to vanish to servants, attendants, and even museum curators. This odor became an unspoken truth about her life. The throne shone brightly in the eyes of the world, but in private it carried the shadow of her neglect. That shadow followed her even into death, when her body betrayed her legacy with a speed and intensity that no ceremony could disguise. The story of her hygiene may seem small compared to the sweep of empire, but it reveals something essential. It shows how power can mask flaws, how appearances can outweigh reality, and how silence can preserve an image at the cost of truth. It also shows how history is not only written in documents and speeches, but also in the marks left on objects, rooms, and memories. Victoria's reign was not only political, it was physical, and that physicality left traces that time could not erase. Her name endures in history books. Her statues stand across the world, and her reign is remembered as one of the longest and most influential in British history. Yet for those who stood close to her, what endures most vividly is something entirely different. It is the memory of an odor that clung to fabrics, seeped into furniture, and haunted the palace. That odor became her unspoken legacy. The part of her story no one wanted to write, but no one could forget. Victoria ruled for almost a century, but her body never escaped the shadow of neglect. Her throne carried both the light of empire and the weight of her private habits. For many who knew her, the true inheritance she left behind was not only monuments and laws, but the lingering scent of a queen who never embraced the simplest acts of care. This was the smell of her throne, a reminder that greatness and decay often sit side by side. This concludes the story of Queen Victoria's hidden hygiene, a side of history rarely spoken of, but deeply revealing. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. May your night be peaceful, your rest undisturbed, and may you drift into sleep far away from the heavy air of Buckingham Palace. Good night. Sweet dreams.